It was a stupid thing to do, looking back. An impulse, a whim born from the kind of youthful arrogance that tells you the world is yours for the taking and danger is just a myth. I was barely 20, a year out of high school, full of restless energy and an unhealthy dose of self-reliance. This was back in 2008, before smartphones truly tethered us to the world, before every single moment was documented, before the internet truly mapped every hidden corner. That isolation, that disconnect, played a huge part in what happened. I spent that summer working construction jobs, saving up for community college. Most weekends, I'd take my beat-up '96 Toyota Tacoma and head north, chasing the coastline. I wasn't looking for parties or crowds, I just wanted to be alone with the ocean, exploring tide pools and forgotten stretches of beach. It was my escape, my way of feeling grounded and free all at once. My parents, bless them, always worried. "Be careful, Daniel," my mom would say. "Don't go too far out." My dad, a man of few words, would just nod grimly, his own experiences with the ocean's unpredictable nature making him cautious. I'd always tell them I would, of course, then promptly ignore it the moment the wheels hit the highway. This particular weekend, I'd driven further than usual, past the usual tourist spots, into a region where the asphalt gave way to gravel and the towering redwoods hugged the shore like ancient guardians. My destination was a small, unmarked cove I'd found on an old, faded map, a place accessible only at low tide. It promised solitude, and it delivered. The drive alone was enough to thin the herd, winding roads, sheer drops, and no cell service for miles. When I finally parked my truck hidden beneath a canopy of pines, the only sound was the distant roar of the Pacific and the rustle of wind through the branches. I packed light, a small backpack with water, a couple of energy bars, my old waterproof flashlight, and a cheap compass, practical stuff. I didn't think I'd need anything else. The path down to the beach was steep, overgrown, and slippery with pine needles. I had to scramble down parts of it, grabbing onto exposed roots, my boots digging into the loose earth. More than once, I nearly lost my footing, picturing myself tumbling head over heels into the cold, crashing waves below. It was exhilarating, a small test of my capabilities. I remember thinking, this is living. Reaching the bottom, I stepped onto a narrow strip of dark, volcanic sand, still damp from the receding tide. Towering cliffs, worn smooth by centuries of wind and water, rose on either side, creating a natural amphitheater open only to the vast expanse of the ocean. The air smelled of salt and kelp and something else, something cold and ancient, like wet stone. The tide was almost fully out, exposing a jagged rocky shelf that stretched out into the water, a natural barrier against the full force of the waves. And there, tucked away at the base of the tallest cliff, was the cave. It wasn't a grand, cathedral-like opening, more of a narrow, dark maw framed by glistening black rock. The entrance was just wide enough for me to squeeze through, perhaps 8 feet high at its apex, but quickly narrowing and sloping downwards. This was it, the reason I'd driven all this way. I'd seen pictures of similar sea caves in geology books, incredible formations carved by the relentless ocean, but this one felt different. It had a presence, a quiet power. Before I ventured inside, I checked my watch. The tide would start coming in again in about 2 hours. Plenty of time, I figured, to explore a bit, take a few photos with my old disposable camera, and then head back. I always gave myself an hour and a half margin for error. That was part of my routine, part of my safety protocol. I wasn't completely reckless, just mostly. The mouth of the cave was draped with thick, dark seaweed, slick and heavy, like wet curtains. As I pushed through them, a sudden, inexplicable chill enveloped me, much colder than the sea air outside. The sound of the waves, which had been a constant, comforting roar just moments before, became muted, swallowed by the rock. Inside, it was truly dark. Not just dim, but a profound, heavy darkness that seemed to press in on all sides. My eyes struggled to adjust, failing to find any discernible shape or depth. It was like stepping into a void. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam, a thin, yellow spear, cut through the black, revealing a low, damp ceiling and walls that glistened with moisture. The floor was rough, uneven rock, covered in pools of brackish water and scattered with smooth, dark pebbles. The air here was still heavy and carried a faint, earthy scent mixed with the unmistakable tang of the ocean. It was an oppressive kind of silence, the kind that makes your own breathing sound unnaturally loud. My heart, I noticed, had begun to beat a little faster. Not from fear, I told myself, but from the thrill of discovery, the excitement of venturing somewhere unknown. As I took my first tentative steps deeper into the cave, the silence persisted, thick and unbroken. It was then, just as my flashlight beam swept over a particularly large, dark pool of water near the back wall, that it happened. A sound, so faint, so fleeting, that at first I thought it was just the ringing in my ears, an auditory phantom born from the sudden silence. But then it came again, a whisper. It was almost imperceptible, a soft, hushed breath of sound that seemed to curl out of the darkness itself. It wasn't a growl or a drip or the splash of water. It was distinct, and it sounded like human speech. A very, very low murmur, like someone talking just out of earshot, indistinct and muffled, but undeniably conversational. My hand instinctively tightened around the flashlight. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear it again. The cave, for a moment, seemed to hold its own breath too. Then nothing, just the drip of water from the ceiling, echoing unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. I told myself it was the wind whistling through a crack in the rock, or maybe just the strange acoustics of the cave playing tricks on my ears. That's all it could be, right? I swung the flashlight beam wildly around the small cavern, searching for any sign, any source. There was nothing but dark, wet rock. I stood there for a good minute, my heart hammering a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The thrill of discovery had curdled into something else, a prickle of unease that crawled up my spine. My rational mind was already working overtime, trying to find an explanation, any explanation, for what I'd just heard. But even as I searched for logical answers, a deeper, more primal part of me knew that something was off. This wasn't just a cave, this was something else. And the thought, unbidden and unsettling, began to bloom in the cold, damp air. I am not alone here. The thought, I am not alone here, was a chilling whisper that echoed in my own head, far more disturbing than the faint murmur I'd initially heard. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, each beat a stark reminder of my solitude in that deep, dark space. I told myself it was ridiculous. A cave, just a cave. The acoustics of such places were notoriously tricky. Sounds bounced, distorted, created illusions. But the distinct impression of human speech, low and conversational, refused to be dismissed. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to regain some semblance of calm. My grip on the flashlight was so tight my knuckles ached. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weak and thin in the oppressive quiet. It was a stupid thing to do, I realized immediately. If someone was in here and they meant harm, I just announced my presence. And if it was not human, well, I didn't want to think about that. The silence answered me, a heavy, absolute silence that seemed to press down on my eardrums. I waited, straining every nerve, my eyes darting frantically through the limited cone of light. Nothing, just the glistening rock, the brackish pools, the oppressive darkness. My rational mind, always quick to assert itself, began to offer explanations. Maybe it was a squall of wind, funneled through an unseen crack mimicking voices. Maybe it was water drips falling at just the right frequency to create a momentary auditory illusion. Yes, that had to be it. The human brain was wired to find patterns even where none existed. I was just being jumpy. But the unease lingered, a cold knot in my gut. I checked my watch again. 1 hour had passed. I had another hour before I needed to be out of the cave, back on the beach, well clear of the rising tide. I should turn back now. Common sense screamed it, but the thrill of discovery, that youthful arrogance, still had its hooks in me. I was here. I'd come all this way. What if there was something truly incredible just around the next bend? A new species of cave-dwelling organism, an ancient relic. My imagination, already overactive, conjured images from adventure movies and old mythology. Just a little further, I muttered to myself, trying to sound confident. 5 more minutes. I took another tentative step, then another, pushing deeper into the cave. The passage remained narrow, barely wide enough for me to pass without scraping my backpack against the wet rock walls. The floor sloped gently downwards, and the air grew noticeably colder, a damp, biting chill that seeped through my thin jacket. The earthy smell was more prominent here, mixed with something else, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. My flashlight beam, my only guide, danced ahead, revealing a new feature. The passage opened slightly into a small, irregular chamber, perhaps 15 feet across. The ceiling here was lower, roughly eye level in places, forcing me to duck my head. In the center of the chamber, the water was deeper, forming a murky pool that disappeared into the darkness on the far side. It looked like a natural cul-de-sac, a dead end. Disappointment warred with my lingering apprehension. I swept the light around, carefully examining every surface. The walls were smooth in places, pitted in others, etched with the countless millennia of geological forces. There were no stalactites or stalagmites, just the raw, unadorned rock. Then something caught my eye. Near the far wall, partially submerged in the murky water, was a shape. It wasn't natural. My heart gave a jolt. I focused the beam, stepping closer, my boots splashing softly in the shallow water that covered the chamber floor. It was a column, crudely carved from the dark rock, maybe 3 feet tall, thicker than my body. Its top was flat, forming a sort of rough pedestal. What was it doing here? Who could have brought it or carved it? The questions tumbled over each other in my mind. The rock here was volcanic, hard and unforgiving. Carving something like this would have taken immense effort and ancient tools. I reached the pedestal, my hand hovering over its cold, wet surface. It felt strangely smooth, almost polished in places, despite the rough-hewn appearance. As my light lingered, I saw them, markings, not casual graffiti, but deliberate, intricate etchings covering the top and sides of the column. They weren't pictograms I recognized, no symbols from any culture I'd ever seen. They were flowing, organic lines, twisting and interweaving like seaweed or tendrils. Some resembled distorted eyes, others abstract, elongated figures. They were unsettling, hypnotic, and undeniably ancient. The carvings felt alien, imbued with a sense of purpose I couldn't grasp, yet that purpose radiated an almost palpable dread. As I traced the patterns with my flashlight, a faint tremor ran through the rock beneath my feet. It wasn't an earthquake, not a violent shake, but a low, resonant vibration like a distant, deep hum. It seemed to come from within the rock itself. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, and it sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. And then the sound returned. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a low, mournful sigh, long and drawn out, like the sound of wind through a vast, empty space. It seemed to emanate from the very walls around me, swirling and echoing, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. This was no trick of the wind. This was too deliberate, too sad. My blood ran cold. The rational explanations I'd clung to crumbled. This wasn't a natural cave formation. That column, those markings, that sound, something was here. something ancient and powerful, and it was making its presence known. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at my throat. My earlier cockiness evaporated, replaced by a visceral need to escape. I spun around, my flashlight beam wildly cutting through the darkness, looking for the narrow passage I'd entered through. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the chamber, where the murky water deepened, something glinted. A faint, greenish glow flickering almost imperceptibly just beneath the surface. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, pulsing with a soft, otherworldly light. Curiosity, a perverse, self-destructive impulse, warred with my escalating fear. What was that? Was it a bioluminescent organism, a trick of the light on some mineral deposit, or something else entirely? The whisper, the sigh, the carvings, my mind raced, trying to connect the dots, trying to find a logical explanation for the growing strangeness. Against all better judgment, I found myself stepping towards the glow, the water reaching my knees, then my thighs. The cold was intense, a bone-deep chill that made my muscles ache. The greenish light grew slightly stronger as I approached, revealing its source, a fissure in the rock, almost perfectly straight, slicing downwards into the black depths of the pool. The light seemed to emanate from within this fissure, a steady, unblinking pulse. As I peered into the glowing crack, a sudden, violent surge of water erupted from it, slamming into my chest. I stumbled backwards, gasping, losing my footing in the murky water. My head struck something hard, the carved pedestal. Pain flared, a blinding white-hot agony. The flashlight flew from my hand, splashing into the deep water of the pool. Darkness, absolute, suffocating darkness. The blow to my head had stunned me. I was disoriented, half submerged in the freezing water, my head throbbing. The sudden loss of light was terrifying, amplifying the oppressive silence that instantly returned, thicker and heavier than before. I thrashed, trying to find my footing, my hands grasping wildly for something to hold onto. The rock walls were slick and cold. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest, beating a deafening rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't see anything. The greenish glow from the fissure was gone, swallowed by the sudden influx of water, or perhaps my own dazed perception. I was blind, lost, and bleeding. I could feel the warm stickiness on the side of my head mingling with the icy water. Panic took full hold. "Hello," I croaked, my voice a pathetic whisper. No answer, just the echoing drips of water, the sound of my own ragged breathing. I needed to get out now, the tide. How long had I been in here? I fumbled in the darkness, trying to feel my way back to the exit. My hands scraped against the rough rock walls, searching for the narrow passage. But in the blackness, everything felt the same. Cold, wet, endless. Then I heard it again, closer this time. No longer a whisper or a sigh, it was a voice. A low, guttural chanting, not in any language I knew, but undeniably words. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from below, from the fissure, from the depths of the pool. It was multiple voices, intertwined, overlapping, building in intensity. They sounded ancient, raw, resonating with a primeval power that vibrated through the water and through my very bones. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The chill intensified, becoming an unbearable, piercing cold. I scrambled backwards away from the pool, my terror overriding the pain in my head. I slipped and fell, hitting the water hard, a gasp escaping my lips. My hands connected with the carved pedestal, which was now vibrating with the chanting, a low, ominous thrum. I pushed myself up, my legs shaking, my eyes wide and useless in the pitch black. The chanting grew louder, faster, a frantic crescendo that seemed to suck the air from the cave. And then, from the fissure, from the deep, an unimaginable light erupted. Not the soft green glow from before. This was a blinding, iridescent light, swirling with all the colors of the deepest ocean, pulsing with an intense, living energy. It lit the entire chamber, revealing the glistening, wet rock walls, the dark, churning water, and my own terrified face reflected in a dozen pools. And then I saw them. Shapes in the water, not fish, not seals, not anything I'd ever seen. They were translucent, shimmering forms, moving with an unnatural grace, their outlines shifting and blurring in the radiant light. They were humanoid in shape, but elongated, slender, with limbs that seemed to stretch and contract like kelp in a current. Their skin, if it was skin, was opalescent, catching the light like mother of pearl. Their faces were smooth, devoid of features, except for large, luminous eyes that glowed with the same unsettling, multi-hued light as the fissure. They were countless, swimming up from the depths of the pool, emerging from the fissure as if it were a gateway. My breath hitched, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. These were not human, not animals. They were something else, something utterly alien, utterly terrifying. The chanting reached a fever pitch coming from these creatures, an impossibly deep chorus that echoed through the small chamber, resonating directly in my skull. They began to circle the carved pedestal, their movements fluid and mesmerizing, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They weren't moving towards me aggressively, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I finally found my voice, a choked, terrified scream that died in my throat, drowned out by the unearthly chorus. I stumbled backward again, tripping over my own feet, desperate to put distance between myself and these impossible beings. My hand slammed against the rock wall of the chamber. My fingers found something. A ledge, a small, almost invisible crevice high above the water line. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct, I began to scramble upwards, clinging to the rough rock, pulling myself towards the crevice. My head throbbed, my muscles screamed, but the fear was a powerful motivator. I had to get out. I had to get away from them. As I climbed, the light from the fissure intensified, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around the chamber. The creatures below continued their chanting, their glowing eyes following my every move. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, an ancient, terrifying ceremony, and I had stumbled into the heart of it. I managed to pull myself into the crevice. It was barely wide enough for my body, a tight, claustrophobic space, but it was higher up, out of the immediate reach of the water. I pressed myself against the cold rock, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I could still see them, their iridescent forms swirling below, their chants filling the air. And then one of them separated from the group. It was larger than the others, its form more distinct, its glow more intense. It rose slowly from the water, floating effortlessly, its elongated limbs extending. It turned its featureless face towards me, and I felt a piercing sensation, as if it were looking directly into my mind, probing my thoughts, my very soul. The chanting began to subside, fading into a low, resonant hum. The large creature floated closer, its luminous eyes fixed on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself further into the rock, trying to become invisible. I could feel its presence, a cold, ancient power radiating towards me. When I finally dared to open my eyes, it was hovering just below my crevice, its face inches from mine, its glowing eyes staring into my own. It didn't speak in words, but a thought, clear and sharp as ice, slammed into my mind. You do not belong here. You have seen what you were not meant to see. A terror, absolute and soul-crushing, rendered me motionless. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. And these beings were not just strange, they were intelligent, powerful, and utterly beyond my comprehension. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the creature began to recede, sinking back into the water, its form blurring with the others. The iridescent light from the fissure dimmed, then vanished completely, plunging the chamber back into oppressive darkness. The chanting ceased, replaced by the sound of rushing water. A surge of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. They were gone, but the fear remained, a cold, heavy weight in my chest. The image of their glowing eyes, their shifting forms, was burned into my mind. But the silence didn't last. The sound of rushing water grew louder, closer. Not the gentle lapping of the ocean from outside, but a deep, churning roar. I realized with a fresh wave of terror that the water level in the chamber was rising, rapidly. The tide, I'd completely forgotten about the tide. In my panic, in my encounter with the impossible, the real-world danger had slipped from my mind. Now it was returning with a vengeance. The ocean was reclaiming its territory, and I was still trapped deep inside the cave. I peered down into the blackness. I could hear the powerful rush of water, swirling and churning. The crevice I was in was above the current water level, but it was narrow, exposed, and led nowhere. I had to get back to the main passage, to the exit. I carefully lowered myself from the crevice, my body aching, my head throbbing. My hands immediately plunged into cold water. It was now waist-deep, rising fast. The chamber I was in was filling, becoming a dark, churning pool. The entrance to the main passage was somewhere to my left. I could feel the powerful pull of the current, trying to drag me towards the central pool, towards the fissure where they had been. I fought against it, stumbling blindly through the rising water, my arms outstretched, trying to find the wall, trying to find my way. The water was already up to my chest. The air was heavy with moisture, and the roar of the incoming tide was deafening. I was losing my bearings. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable. Every sense was screaming danger. My hand finally slapped against a solid rock wall. I scrambled along it, desperate, feeling for the opening to the main passage. The current was growing stronger, threatening to tear me from my grip. I could feel debris, bits of kelp and small rocks swirling around my legs. Then my fingers found it, the narrow opening, barely wide enough for my shoulders. I squeezed through, pulling myself into the main passage, away from the rising water in the chamber. The water level in this passage was lower, only knee-deep, but it was still rising and the current was strong. I moved as quickly as I could, splashing and stumbling, driven by an almost primal fear. The passage seemed endless, stretching on forever in the absolute blackness. My head wound was bleeding freely now, the warm blood mixing with the icy cave water. I was shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from sheer terror. I didn't know how much time had passed since I'd checked my watch. The crucial hour and a half margin for error was almost certainly gone. I imagined the entrance to the cave, the narrow maw draped with seaweed, now completely submerged, churning with the full force of the Pacific. My flashlight, it was gone, lost in the deep pool. My compass. I'd lost my sense of direction entirely. All I could do was push forward, hoping I was heading towards the exit, praying I wasn't going deeper. Suddenly, the current intensified, grabbing me, spinning me around. I slammed against a jagged rock wall, scraping my arm. A cry of pain escaped me. I fought against the powerful surge, trying to keep my footing, but it was too strong. The water was now up to my chest, then my neck. I was being swept away, deeper into the cave, or so it felt. I gasped, swallowing a mouthful of cold, salty water. My lungs burned. I kicked, thrashed, trying to regain control. The roar of the ocean was all around me, amplified by the confines of the cave, becoming a monstrous, living sound. I was being pulled, dragged along by the relentless current. My hands scraped against the ceiling, the walls, anything I could touch to try and slow myself. I knew with a horrifying certainty that if I didn't find the exit soon, I would drown. Trapped in this black, watery tomb, with them somewhere in the deeper chambers, their chants perhaps still echoing through the dark water. My fingers brushed against something, not rock, something smooth, slick, and leathery. Thick, heavy strands, the seaweed curtains, the entrance. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I lunged towards it, pushing through the thick, cold fronds. The force of the current tried to pull me back, but I fought with everything I had, propelled by the raw will to survive. I burst through the curtain of seaweed, gasping, my head breaking the surface of the water. Air, cold, salty, glorious air, but it was fleeting. The waves outside were crashing against the cliff face, surging inwards, completely covering the cave mouth. I was in a narrow pocket of air, pressed against the ceiling as the water roared around me. The cave was completely submerged. My escape had been by mere seconds. I could see nothing. The outside world was a blur of churning, black water and the deafening roar of the ocean. I was trapped between the receding air pocket and the relentless incoming tide, compressed by the immense pressure of the ocean. My body was battered, bruised, and exhausted. My head throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that even if the tide receded, I wouldn't make it. The path up the cliff face was steep, treacherous, and now likely battered by the waves. I was too weak, too injured. And then I heard it again, not from within the cave, but from outside. A soft, almost gentle tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, against the rock face just above where I was clinging. A chilling counterpoint to the raging ocean. Tappy, tappy, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the cliff, from the dark, wet rock that rose above the submerged cave. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my head against the cold, damp rock ceiling. The tapping grew more insistent, accompanied by a faint scraping sound like claws on stone. I was no longer alone in the dark cave. Whatever had been down there in the depths was now out here with me. The rhythmic tapping grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by the scraping sound. It was distinct, not the random noise of waves or shifting rock. It was deliberate. Tappy tap, tap tap tap, it echoed in the small air pocket, a chilling counterpoint to the thunderous roar of the ocean just inches below me. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in my own ears. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I was trapped, above whatever was making that sound. Below the churning black water that had devoured the cave. My body was screaming in protest, my head throbbed, a dull, relentless pain, and the cold had seeped into my very bones, making my limbs heavy and sluggish. But the fear was a far more potent sensation, overriding everything else. I pressed myself further into the rock, trying to flatten my body to make myself as small and invisible as possible. My eyes were useless in the absolute darkness. I could only strain my ears, trying to decipher the sounds above me. The tapping wasn't coming from directly overhead, but slightly to my left, just around the curve of the cliff face where the rock rose dramatically. The scraping became more pronounced, a grating sound that spoke of something heavy being dragged or something sharp digging into stone. It was methodical, unhurried, terrifying in its calm persistence. My mind, already frayed, raced to comprehend. Were they out there, the creatures from the cave? How could they be on the cliff face? They were aquatic, weren't they? Or was there something else, something even worse? The thought, "You do not belong here. You have seen what you were not meant to see," slammed into my mind again, unbidden, as clear as if the creature was whispering it directly into my ear. It brought with it a fresh wave of terror. They knew I was here. They had been looking at me, probing my mind. It wasn't just a random accident that I was trapped. It felt deliberate. Time stretched, a torturous eternity in the blackness. Each second felt like an hour. I hung there, suspended between the rock and the surging water, listening to the impossible sounds above. The tapping continued for what felt like endless minutes, then gradually it began to recede, moving further up the cliff, or perhaps simply moving away from my immediate vicinity. The scraping faded, then ceased altogether. A shaky breath escaped me, a gasping sob. Had they gone, or were they just waiting, watching? The oppressive silence that followed was almost worse than the noise, because now my imagination had free rein. Every drip of water, every creak of the rock became a potential threat. My entire body began to tremble uncontrollably. The cold was unbearable, an all-encompassing ache that made my teeth chatter so violently I thought they would crack. My arms and legs were numb, heavy. I tried to shift, to get more comfortable, but there was no comfort to be found. The space was too cramped, the rock too hard, the air too thin. I could taste blood in my mouth and the salt of the ocean spray. I estimated it had been at least 2 hours since I'd entered the cave. The tide was likely at its peak now. That meant I had to wait for it to recede, which would take another 3 or 4 hours. 4 hours, trapped like this, in the dark, alone with what I had just seen. The realization brought a fresh wave of despair. I couldn't last that long, not like this. I was already shivering violently, my muscles cramping. Hypothermia was a real and immediate danger. And what if the air pocket didn't hold? What if a rogue wave surged in and drowned me? What if they came back? My mind was a whirlwind of terrifying scenarios. I tried to focus, to calm myself, to think rationally. But rationality had deserted me the moment those glowing, featureless faces had risen from the deep. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure images of my truck, of the highway, of my parents' worried faces. Anything to anchor me to the real world, to remind me that this nightmare wasn't forever. But the images were fleeting, quickly replaced by the swirling, iridescent light and the silent, judging gaze of those alien beings. Hours crawled by, I lost all track of time. My body ached with a dull, persistent pain. My head wound had stopped bleeding, but it was tender and swollen. I felt a growing sense of detachment, a kind of numb resignation. I was going to die here, trapped, alone, and no one would ever know what had happened to me or what I had seen. Then slowly, subtly, something shifted. The relentless pressure of the water against the cliff face seemed to lessen. The roar, while still deafening, became less intense, less immediate. It was almost imperceptible at first, but then I felt it. The water level was beginning to drop. A faint flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, ignited within me. I was still alive. The tide was receding. I might have a chance. I waited, forcing myself to be patient, listening intently. The air pocket, though still cramped, seemed to gain a tiny bit of space. The sounds of the ocean began to change, the harsh, crashing waves giving way to a more rhythmic ebb and flow. It was a slow, agonizing process, but it was happening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I risked a small movement. My feet, which had been dangling in the water, now touched the cave floor, albeit shallowly. The entrance, I hoped, was becoming passable again. Cautiously, stiff with cold and fear, I began to lower myself. The water was still chest-deep, swirling powerfully, but the current wasn't as violent as before. I could feel the rough, familiar texture of the cave mouth, the slick seaweed that still clung to the rock. I pushed through the curtain of kelp, my body trembling with effort. The main passage was dark, echoing, and still filled with rushing water, but I could hear the faint, muffled roar of the waves from outside. I was no longer completely submerged. My hands scraped against the rock walls, guiding me. I could barely lift my legs, my muscles screaming in protest. The cold was still debilitating, making every movement a monumental effort. I stumbled, fell, pushed myself back up, driven by the raw, primal instinct to escape. The passage seemed longer now, a winding, watery labyrinth in the absolute darkness. My mind replayed the images of the creatures, the chanting, the iridescent light. I forced them down, focusing only on placing one foot in front of the other, on feeling for the changes in the rock, the subtle slope upwards that would lead to the beach. I didn't know how I was going to climb the cliff in my state, but that was a problem for later. First, I needed to get out of the water, out of the cave. After what felt like an endless journey through the cold, dark water, I finally felt the ground rise beneath my feet. The water receded to my knees, then to my ankles. The air grew fresher, colder, carrying the unmistakable scent of the open ocean. My eyes, still useless in the blackness of the cave's interior, began to discern a faint, gray light ahead. The entrance, the actual opening to the outside world. With a final surge of adrenaline, I stumbled towards it, collapsing onto the wet sand just beyond the cave mouth. I lay there, gasping for air, my body shaking violently. The cold was excruciating, but the sheer relief of being out of the water, out of the dark, was overwhelming. The sky was a bruised, pre-dawn gray, hinting at the first faint streaks of light on the eastern horizon. The moon, a thin crescent, hung high above, casting a ghostly sheen on the churning waves. The beach, a narrow strip of dark sand, was still mostly submerged, but the tide was definitely on its way out. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming, my head throbbing. I needed to move, to get higher up the beach, away from the immediate reach of the waves. Every fiber of my being wanted to collapse, to just lie there and let exhaustion claim me, but the memory of those things in the cave and the tapping on the cliff spurred me on. I staggered across the wet sand towards the base of the towering cliff. The sheer face loomed over me, dark and imposing. The path I'd taken down earlier was now a faint, treacherous scramble of loose earth and exposed roots. It looked impossible. I scanned the beach, my eyes stinging from the salt and the cold. My truck, where was my truck? I'd left it hidden under the pines, far above. It felt 1,000,000 miles away. My gaze drifted back to the cliff. It was then, as the first faint hint of sunlight touched the topmost crags, that I saw it. Something was etched into the sheer rock face just above the high tide line, maybe 20 feet up. Not carvings like those on the pedestal in the cave. This was different. These were freshly scored lines, deep gouges in the dark rock, and they formed a pattern. A pattern I recognized. It was one of the symbols from the carved pedestal. The twisting, elongated, tendril-like design. It was large, maybe 10 feet across, carved with undeniable force, and it was radiating a faint, almost imperceptible greenish glow, even in the encroaching dawn light. My blood ran cold. They had been here, whatever had been making those tapping and scraping sounds. They had climbed the sheer cliff face or ascended it somehow to carve this symbol. A message, a warning, or something else entirely. The implication was terrifying. They weren't confined to the water. They weren't just cave dwellers. They could traverse the land, the rock, with an unnatural ease. And they were actively marking their territory or performing some ritual outside the cave. My brief moment of relief evaporated, replaced by a renewed, paralyzing fear. I had to get away, now. But the cliff path, it was too steep, too treacherous, especially in my current state. I looked around desperately. There had to be another way. My eyes fell on a pile of large, water-smoothed boulders at the far end of the cove, where the cliffs met the ocean in a jumble of ancient rock. Perhaps there was a way to scramble up there to find a less steep ascent. It was a long shot, but it was my only shot. I began to move, dragging my battered body across the wet sand towards the jumble of rocks. Every step was agony. My legs felt like lead, my head pounded with each exertion. The cold gnawed at me, and I was trembling violently. As I struggled, a strange, high-pitched keening sound echoed from somewhere above the cliff face, carried on the pre-dawn wind. It was not a human sound, not an animal sound. It was mournful, yet had an unsettling, almost melodic quality to it. It was the same sound I'd heard in the cave, the sigh, but now amplified, clearer, and undeniably originating from the land above. It was them, they were up there, and they were making that sound. I pushed harder, a fresh surge of terror fueling my exhausted limbs. I stumbled towards the rocks, desperation overriding pain. I reached the jumble of boulders, their surfaces slick with moisture and seaweed. It was a chaotic mess of rock, but offered handholds and footholds, a steep, treacherous path upwards. I began to climb, pulling myself up with every ounce of strength I had left. My fingers slipped on the wet rock, my feet scrabbled for purchase. I scraped my shins, my knees, my hands. The salt water stung my open wounds. I could feel the blood, warm and sticky, mixing with the cold spray. The keening sound intensified, seeming to swirl around me, filling the cove. It felt like a lament, a warning, or perhaps a summons. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get away. I pulled myself onto a wider ledge, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. I was maybe 30 feet up, still far from the top, but higher than the carved symbol. I risked a glance back at the cave entrance. It was a dark, insignificant maw now, half submerged in the retreating tide. The beach was widening, revealing more of the volcanic sand. The keening sound seemed to be coming from directly above me now, closer. I froze, pressing myself against the rock, trying to melt into the shadows. My eyes darted upwards, searching the dim, pre-dawn light. And then I saw it. A shape perched on a jagged outcrop near the very top of the cliff, silhouetted against the paling sky. It was tall, slender, and utterly still. Its form was indistinct in the gloom, but I could make out elongated limbs, a head that seemed too small for its body, and a strange, almost shimmering quality to its outline. One of them up there watching me. My heart seized in my chest. It wasn't just a symbol on the rock. They were physically present above the water on land. The realization was staggering, terrifying. Everything I thought I knew about them, about what they were, was wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound now. It just stood there, a dark, ominous sentinel against the gathering light, its presence radiating the same cold, ancient power I had felt in the cave. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew its eyes, luminous and multifaceted, were fixed on me. I slowly, cautiously began to move again, pulling myself further up the cliff. I couldn't stop. I couldn't look away. The creature didn't pursue me, didn't even shift. It merely watched, a silent, terrifying guardian. The climb was relentless. My muscles burned, my lungs ached, but the sight of that silent sentinel above me spurred me on. I imagined its glowing eyes, its featureless face, watching my desperate struggle. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my outstretched hand grabbed onto a root thick and gnarled that grew out from the very lip of the cliff. With a final, agonizing surge of strength, I pulled myself over the edge, collapsing onto the soft, pine needle-covered earth. I lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. The ground felt impossibly solid, impossibly safe after the treacherous rock and churning water. I was out. I had made it. Cautiously, I pushed myself up, my head swimming. The world spun for a moment, and I had to lean against a tree to steady myself. The first rays of the rising sun were now piercing through the redwood canopy, casting dappled light on the forest floor. I looked back towards the edge of the cliff. The creature was gone. The keening sound had ceased. There was nothing but the vast, silent forest and the distant roar of the ocean. Had it been an illusion, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and terror? No. The raw gouges on the cliff face, the pain in my body, the vivid, horrifying memories told me it had been all too real. I stumbled through the forest, trying to find the faint, overgrown path that led to my truck. My mind was a jumble of fear, disbelief, and a profound, bone-deep weariness. I just needed to get to the truck, to get away, to leave this place and everything I had seen behind. The forest seemed different now. The ancient redwoods, which had felt like guardians before, now felt like silent witnesses, their towering forms holding secrets too old and terrible for human understanding. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shimmering, featureless form gliding between the trees. It took me a long time, but I finally found the hidden clearing where I'd parked my Tacoma. It stood there, a familiar, comforting sight, a tangible link to the normal world. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert them into the lock. I threw open the driver's side door, practically falling into the seat. The worn fabric, the familiar smell of old coffee and dust, it was all a lifeline. I jammed the key into the ignition, my heart hammering. The engine turned over, coughed, then roared to life. The sound was a glorious symphony. I shifted into reverse, spinning the truck around and slammed it into drive, speeding out of the clearing, tires spitting gravel. I didn't care about the rough road, the winding turns. I just wanted to be gone. As I drove, the sun rose higher, painting the sky in fiery oranges and pinks. but the beauty of the dawn was lost on me. My mind was a dark, churning sea of fear and incomprehension. I drove for what felt like hours, not stopping, not even daring to look in the rearview mirror. The winding, isolated roads eventually gave way to paved highway, and the towering redwoods thinned out, replaced by more familiar coastal scrub. I was safe, I was out, but the terror didn't recede. It clung to me, a cold, heavy shroud. The images of those beings, their glowing eyes, their silent judgment, were seared into my mind. The sound of their chanting, their mournful keening, echoed in my ears. The words, "You do not belong here, you have seen what you were not meant to see," repeated like a mantra. When I finally reached a small, sleepy coastal town, I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station, my hands still clenched white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. My body sagged, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving me utterly spent. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs wobbly, and leaned against the door, taking deep, shuddering breaths of the cool morning air. I felt like I had aged 10 years in a single night. I reached up and touched my throbbing head wound. It was dry now, but tender. My clothes were torn, caked with mud and salt. My reflection in the truck's window showed a wild-eyed, pale stranger. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that my life had changed forever. I had stumbled upon something ancient, something impossible, something that defied all human understanding, and I had seen it. I had witnessed their ritual. I had felt their presence, and they knew I had. The world I had known, the simple, predictable world of construction jobs and weekend drives, was gone. It had been shattered, replaced by a terrifying, hidden reality I could never unsee. And the thought, unbidden, whispered its way into my exhausted mind. What now? How do you live with something like this? How do you forget? And more importantly, how do you know they won't come looking for you? I pulled out my old flip phone. No service. Of course, I slammed it back into my pocket. My parents. I needed to call them, tell them I was okay. But what could I say? "Hey Mom, Dad, I almost drowned in a cave and saw an ancient race of glowing, telepathic, humanoid creatures that can climb cliffs and perform rituals." They'd think I was insane. I bought a cheap coffee and a bottle of water from the gas station, my movements slow and clumsy. The mundane transaction felt surreal. The cheerful clerk, the humming fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee, it all seemed utterly alien after the darkness and terror of the cave. I got back into my truck, the lukewarm coffee doing little to thaw the internal chill. I had to drive south, back home, back to my old life. But I knew with a chilling certainty that my old life was irrevocably broken. The innocence of youthful arrogance, the belief that danger was just a myth, had been brutally stripped away. The world was not mine for the taking. And there were things in it, hiding in its forgotten corners, that were far more ancient and powerful than I could ever have imagined. The drive home was a blur. My mind kept replaying the events of the night, the strange murmur, the carved pedestal, the glowing fissure, the rise of the creatures, their telepathic warning, the tapping on the cliff, the sentinel watching me. Each memory was a fresh stab of terror. I pulled into my parents' driveway, the familiar two-story house a beacon of normalcy. My dad's old sedan was parked in its usual spot. My mom's rose bushes were blooming. It was all exactly as I'd left it, and yet everything was profoundly different. I was profoundly different. I cut the engine, sitting there for a long moment, staring at the front door. How do you tell them? How do you explain the unexplainable? You don't, a voice inside me whispered. You can't. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't. It would shatter their world just as it had shattered mine. I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself to put on a mask of normalcy. I was just tired. A bad night. A scary cave. That's what I would say. That's all I could say. The truth was too immense, too terrifying. I stepped out of the truck, my legs still unsteady. The sun was fully up now, a warm, comforting presence. But the warmth couldn't penetrate the chill that had settled deep within my soul. I walked towards the front door, each step heavy, each moment bringing me closer to the impossible task of pretending that everything was okay. I knew even then that it was a lie I would have to live with for the rest of my life. A secret, dark and terrible, that would forever separate me from everyone I knew. I reached the front door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The mundane action felt monumental. This was the moment I stepped back into a world that no longer made sense to me, a world I was no longer truly a part of. The door opened. My mom's voice, warm and worried, instantly greeted me. "Daniel, where have you been? We were so worried." I forced a smile, a hollow, empty gesture. "Hey, Mom, just got a little lost. Long story, I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. And it was just the beginning of a story I could never tell, a story that was far from over. The front door swung inward with a familiar creak, revealing the warm, inviting chaos of home. The scent of coffee and my mom's signature apple pie mingled in the air, a stark contrast to the salt and kelp that still clung to my clothes, to my hair, to my very being. My mom, a petite woman with kind eyes that perpetually held a trace of worry, was already rushing towards me, her face a mixture of relief and indignation. "Daniel, where have you been? We were so worried. It's almost 7 in the morning. We called your phone a dozen times." Her voice, usually a gentle hum, was sharp with concern, but the underlying affection was unmistakable. I forced that hollow smile, the one I'd practiced in the truck mirror. "Hey, Mom, just got a little lost. Long story, I'm fine." The words felt like sandpaper in my throat, each one a betrayal of the truth, a lie meant to protect her from the incomprehensible. My dad appeared from the kitchen, a mug of coffee in his hand, his brow furrowed. He was a man of few words, but his gaze was always observant. He took in my disheveled appearance, the mud-caked boots, the torn jacket, the wildness in my eyes, and the telltale smear of dried blood on my temple. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Lost," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "You look like you wrestled a bear and lost." He pointed with his chin towards my head. "What happened there?" My hand instinctively went to the wound. It was tender to the touch, a dull ache that had become a constant companion. Just slipped, hit my head on a rock, nothing serious." Another lie, each one piling up, building an invisible wall between me and the people I loved most. My mom, ever the caregiver, was already fluttering around me. "Oh, Daniel, come on, let's get you cleaned up. You're freezing, and then you're going straight to bed. You look absolutely exhausted." She put a hand on my forehead, her touch gentle. "You're so cold." I mumbled something noncommittal, allowing her to guide me towards the bathroom. The bright fluorescent light above the sink was harsh, revealing the full extent of my wretchedness. My face was pale, gaunt, etched with an exhaustion that went deeper than just physical fatigue. My eyes, usually bright and restless, were shadowed wide and held a haunted look that even I didn't recognize. The wound on my temple was a jagged, angry gash, crusted with blood and grime. It looked worse than I remembered. "I'll be fine, Mom," I repeated, a mantra of denial. "Just need a hot shower." She sighed but nodded, handing me a clean towel and a change of clothes. "All right, but don't you dare pass out in there, and don't take too long." Your father and I have a million questions." I nodded, closed the bathroom door, and leaned against it, taking a moment to breathe. The familiar surroundings were a thin veneer over the terrifying reality I'd just escaped. The tiles, the toilet, the floral shower curtain, they were all symbols of a world I no longer fully belonged to. I stripped off my ruined clothes, dropping them in a sodden, muddy heap on the floor. My skin was mottled with goosebumps, and my body was covered in scrapes and bruises. As I stepped into the shower, the hot water hit my skin like 1,000 needles, stinging the open cuts but also bringing a desperate, welcome warmth. I let the water wash over me, trying to scrub away the cold, the fear, the memory of those glowing eyes. But the water, no matter how hot, couldn't reach the chill that had settled deep within my soul. It couldn't wash away the images seared into my mind. I closed my eyes, but it was no use. The darkness behind my eyelids was instantly filled with the swirling, iridescent light, the shifting forms, the featureless faces, their silent, judging gaze. The chanting, low and guttural, resonated in my skull. I gasped, opening my eyes, forcing myself to focus on the mundane patterns of the shower tiles. When I finally emerged, my body felt marginally better, but my head still throbbed and the exhaustion was profound. My mom was waiting for me, a first aid kit in hand. She gently cleaned and disinfected the wound on my temple, her touch surprisingly steady. I flinched, not just from the sting of the antiseptic, but from the intimacy of her care, knowing I was keeping such a monumental secret from her. "There," she said, placing a bandage over the cut. "Try not to let it get wet, and for goodness sake, get some sleep. We'll talk when you wake up." My dad, meanwhile, was silently inspecting my ruined clothes, shaking his head. "That Tacoma's been through hell, hasn't it?" he muttered. "You'll be lucky if it still runs." He tossed the muddy bundle into a laundry basket. "Go on, get some rest." I nodded, grateful for the reprieve. I stumbled into my bedroom, the familiar posters on the wall, the messy desk, the unmade bed, all seemed alien now. I pulled on a clean pair of boxers and collapsed onto the mattress. The world outside my window, bathed in the gentle morning light, felt impossibly distant. Sleep, when it finally came, was a battlefield. The cave returned, vivid and horrifying. I was falling into the black water, the creatures rising around me, their glowing eyes fixed on my terror. The chanting was deafening, reverberating through my bones. I thrashed, struggling to breathe, desperate to escape. I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was dark, the sun having set. I had no idea what time it was. The silence of my bedroom was oppressive, every shadow seeming to hold a lurking threat. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the images, but they clung to me, relentless. This was my new reality. The next few days were a blur of forced normalcy. My parents, after their initial grilling, seemed to accept my vague story of getting lost and slipping on rocks. They were just relieved I was home safe. My mom fussed over my head wound, ensuring I ate, constantly asking if I felt okay. My dad, less outwardly expressive, would just look at me sometimes, a thoughtful, almost suspicious glint in his eyes. I knew he sensed something was off, but he didn't push. I tried to immerse myself in my usual routines. I went to my construction job, hauling lumber and hammering nails, but my movements were sluggish, my focus fractured. Every sudden noise, every unexpected shadow made me jump. I'd find myself staring blankly into space, replaying the moments in the cave, the terror gnawing at me. My coworkers, a rough and tumble bunch, noticed my quietness. "You feeling all right, Danny boy?" "You look like you seen a ghost." I just shrug, offer another weak smile, and go back to work. The urge to research, to understand what I'd seen, was overwhelming. This was 2008, so there were no smartphones, no instant access to information. I had to rely on the library, on old books, and slow internet connections. I spent hours hunched over dusty tomes, searching for anything local legends, forgotten myths, geological anomalies, cryptozoological reports. I typed in keywords like glowing cave creatures, underwater humanoids, ancient sea rituals. Most searches yielded nothing but hoaxes, sci-fi stories, or geological explanations for bioluminescence in deep-sea organisms. But sometimes I'd find fragments, an obscure reference in an old folklore text to deep ones or sea folk said to inhabit remote coastlines, luring sailors to their doom. A faded newspaper clipping from the 1920s about strange lights seen off the coast of a secluded fishing village, followed by unexplained disappearances. A geology forum discussing anomalous seismic readings near certain coastal caves, dismissed as equipment malfunction. None of it was conclusive, but it was enough. Enough to tell me I wasn't entirely insane. Enough to confirm that something was out there, something ancient and hidden just beyond the veil of normal perception. The creatures, they were real, and they weren't just in the cave. They were connected to the entire coastline, to the deep ocean, to something profoundly old and powerful. The symbol, the one carved into the cliff face near the cave entrance, haunted me most of all. I tried to recreate it from memory, sketching its twisting, tendril-like form over and over again in a small notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. I searched for it online in books on ancient symbols, tribal art, esoteric texts. Nothing. It was unique, alien, and deeply disturbing. Weeks turned into a month. The physical wounds healed, leaving only a faint scar on my temple, but the internal wounds festered. I became withdrawn, jumpy, prone to sudden fits of anxiety that would seize me without warning. I started avoiding social gatherings, making excuses to my friends. They understood at first, thinking I was just tired from work or preoccupied with college preparations. But soon their patience wore thin. The invitations stopped coming. I was becoming an island, isolated by my terrifying secret. The paranoia escalated. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the house made my heart leap into my throat. I'd find myself peering out windows late at night, scanning the dark street, convinced that I would see something, some shimmering form, some glowing eyes in the darkness. I never did, but the fear was always there, a cold knot in my stomach. Worst of all were the sounds, the phantom sounds. The low, mournful keening, sometimes I heard it carried on the wind at night or echoing in the silence of my bedroom. The rhythmic tapping, sometimes I heard it from the walls of the house or the ceiling. They were so faint, so fleeting, that I could never be sure if they were real or just echoes of my trauma, my mind playing tricks on me. But the uncertainty was torment. My parents, bless them, attributed my change to post-high school angst or maybe a delayed reaction to a stressful summer. "You're just growing up, Daniel," my mom would say, trying to reassure me. "It's a big change going to college." I'd just nod, pretending to agree, knowing that the change was far more profound, far more terrifying than they could ever imagine. As the summer drew to a close, the date for community college loomed. It was a lifeline, a chance to escape, to start anew, or so I hoped. I packed my meager belongings, my old backpack, my worn-out clothes, my hidden notebook filled with unsettling sketches and fragmented research. I left the beat-up Tacoma, promising my dad I'd fix it up when I came home for breaks. The thought of driving that truck, the one that had carried me to that cove, back to that place, was unbearable. The drive to the college campus, a few hours south, was a solitary journey. I didn't listen to music, just the hum of the road, my mind churning. I kept my eyes on the highway, avoiding any glance towards the coastline, the ocean, the place where my world had fractured. The campus was a bustling, vibrant place, full of eager, fresh-faced students. It should have been exciting, a fresh start. but I felt like an alien, an observer looking in on a world I could no longer relate to. My roommate, a cheerful, talkative kid named Mark, tried to draw me out, but my responses were clipped, my demeanor distant. He eventually gave up, probably deciding I was just antisocial. I buried myself in my studies, hoping that academic rigor would somehow purge the horror from my mind. Geology, ironically, was one of my chosen subjects. I thought that by understanding the earth, the ocean, the forces that shape them, I might find a rational explanation, a way to dismantle the monstrous reality I'd encountered. But every lecture on rock formations, every diagram of tectonic plates only deepened my unease. I saw the patterns of ancient forces, the unimaginable timescales, and my mind always drifted back to the cave, to the column, to the markings, to the beings that seemed to be an embodiment of that primeval power. My grades were decent, a testament to my innate intelligence, but I was constantly exhausted, running on fumes. Sleep was still a torment, filled with nightmares that left me shaking and gasping for breath. I started drinking coffee constantly, trying to ward off the fatigue, trying to keep the dark thoughts at bay. The months blended into a monotonous cycle of classes, library research, and restless nights. I made no real friends, keeping everyone at arm's length. I couldn't risk letting anyone close enough to glimpse the horror I carried within me. The isolation was painful, but it felt necessary. It felt like protection. One rainy afternoon, as I was walking back to my dorm from the library, hunched against the incessant drizzle, I saw it. It was just a flicker, a momentary reflection in a puddle, but it made my heart lurch. A greenish glow, faint, almost imperceptible. I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. I stared into the puddle, but the light was gone, just the dull gray of the sky reflected in the rippling water. My mind immediately flashed back to the fissure, to the glowing crack in the cave, to the eyes of the creatures. It couldn't be, it was impossible. I was hundreds of miles inland, away from the coast, away from them. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of my overactive imagination. I forced myself to continue walking, my pace quickening. But the image of that faint green light had reignited the terror, turning the mundane world around me into a place of subtle menace. The buildings seemed to loom, the trees to sway with an unnatural rhythm. That night the nightmares were more vivid, more relentless than ever. I was back in the cave, the water rising, the creatures swirling around me. But this time they weren't silent. Their voices, that low, guttural chanting, filled my head not just in the dream, but seeming to echo in the waking darkness of my room. I woke screaming, startling Mark, who looked at me with a mixture of concern and irritation. "Dude, are you okay? You were really yelling." I mumbled an excuse, just a bad dream, sorry. I knew he didn't buy it. He hadn't bought it for weeks. He was probably convinced I was some kind of freak, and he wouldn't be wrong. The incident with the puddle and the intensified nightmares chipped away at the fragile sense of control I'd been trying to build. My efforts to rationalize, to dismiss, to forget were failing. The fear was reasserting itself, colder and more potent than before. I spent even more time in the library, desperately searching for anything that could explain what was happening. I ventured into older, more obscure texts, even delving into ancient alien theories and conspiracy websites, things I would have scoffed at just months ago. But nothing seemed to fit the terrifying reality of what I'd witnessed. One evening, deep in the library's archives, I stumbled upon a dusty, brittle book. It was a collection of local legends from the Pacific Northwest, published in the early 20th century. The cover was faded, the pages yellowed. I almost dismissed it, but something about its forgotten appearance drew me in. I flipped through the pages, scanning the titles: The Whispering Pines, The Lost Miner's Gold, The Legend of the Fog Walker. Then I saw it. A chapter titled, The Deep Ones of the Obsidian Shore. My hands began to tremble. I turned to the page, my heart thumping against my ribs. The text was archaic, difficult to read, filled with flowery language and vague descriptions. But the core of the story resonated with a horrifying familiarity. It spoke of ancient beings said to dwell in the deep ocean caves along a particular stretch of the rugged coastline, a description that perfectly matched the area I'd visited. The legends detailed their strange rituals, their connection to the rising and falling tides, and their unearthly light that would sometimes emanate from the depths. It mentioned their inhuman forms and a song that could steal the mind. But what sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins was the final passage. And it is said that those who glimpse the deep ones, those who bear witness to their ancient rites, are marked. They carry the knowledge within them, a seed of the abyss that blossoms in their souls. And though the deep ones may recede, they do not forget. They watch, they wait, for the marked are forever bound to the obsidian shore and to its secrets. The book slid from my trembling fingers, clattering softly onto the table. Marked, forever bound. The words echoed the telepathic message I'd received: you do not belong here, you have seen what you were not meant to see. This wasn't just a local legend, this was a direct, chilling reflection of my own experience. It wasn't just paranoia. They were watching. They were waiting. The realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't safe here. I was never going to be safe. I frantically copied down every relevant passage, every cryptic phrase, every unsettling detail into my notebook. I sketched the crude illustrations from the book, trying to find any resemblance to the symbol I'd seen. There were none identical, but the overall style, the sense of alienness, was eerily similar. I tried to find more information about the book, about its author, about the specific obsidian shore it referenced. But the author was long dead, the publishing house defunct, and the location vague, a general description of the wild, unpopulated coast. It was as if the knowledge itself was meant to be forgotten, to remain buried in dusty archives. The information, though terrifying, brought a strange, twisted sense of relief. I wasn't losing my mind. There was an explanation, however impossible, for what had happened. But that relief was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by a deepening dread. The legend confirmed my worst fears. I was trapped. I was marked. I stopped trying to forget. Instead, I began to study. I delved deeper into the sciences, but also into mythology, esoteric studies, even comparative religion. I was searching for patterns, for connections, for any hint that could give me an edge, any knowledge that could help me understand, or perhaps even fight what I had encountered. My grades started to suffer. I missed classes, spending my time either in the library or pacing restlessly in my dorm room, poring over my notes. Mark, my roommate, finally confronted me. "Dude, seriously, what's going on with you? You're acting like a ghost. You never sleep. You're always reading these weird old books, and you jump at every little noise. Are you on something?" I stared at him, my mind racing. How could I explain? How could I tell him that I wasn't on drugs, but that I had glimpsed a reality far more terrifying than any hallucination? I couldn't. "It's nothing, Mark," I said, my voice flat. "Just stress. College is harder than I thought." He looked at me unconvinced, but mercifully didn't push further. All right, man, just if you need to talk, I'm here, or if you need some sleep, I can crash at a friend's for a night. His genuine concern was a sharp reminder of the normal life I was sacrificing, the connections I was severing. But I knew with a chilling certainty that I couldn't burden him or anyone with this truth. It was mine alone. The fall semester ended and the winter break loomed. I dreaded going home. How could I face my parents, knowing I was carrying this terrifying secret, knowing I was marked by something ancient and malevolent, but I had no choice. The drive back was filled with the same gnawing anxiety. As I neared the familiar coastal highway, my gaze involuntarily drifted towards the ocean, a dark, churning expanse under a gray winter sky. I could almost feel their presence, a cold, watchful gaze from the depths. When I arrived home, my parents were, as always, overjoyed to see me. My mom had cooked all my favorite dishes, and the house was filled with the warmth of the holidays. But I couldn't relax. Every moment felt like a performance, a desperate attempt to appear normal, to laugh at the right times, to offer believable answers to their questions about college. My dad, ever observant, noticed my restlessness. "You still seem on edge, son. What's bothering you?" I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. "Nothing, Dad, just the pressures of school, you know." He grunted, but his eyes held that familiar, knowing glint. "You know, Daniel, sometimes a man just needs to talk things out. Keeping things bottled up, that ain't good." His words struck a chord, a desperate longing to confess, to unburden myself. But the words died in my throat. How could I tell him? How could I tell him about the glowing entities, the ancient rituals, the chilling telepathic message? He would think I was insane. He would worry himself sick. It was a burden I had to bear alone. The holiday break passed in a haze of feigned normalcy and internal torment. I started going for long, solitary walks along the beach, but never near that cove. I'd walk for miles, bundled against the cold, listening to the roar of the waves, searching the horizon, trying to find some answer, some solace in the vastness of the ocean. But the ocean no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a constant, brooding threat. One evening, as I was walking back from the beach, the sun setting in a blaze of purple and orange, I saw it again. A faint, greenish flicker in the deep shadows beneath an old, gnarled cypress tree by the roadside. My heart leaped and I froze, straining my eyes. It was gone, just shadows. But the fear was back, sharp and visceral. It wasn't just in the puddles now. It was in the shadows, in the periphery of my vision, always just out of reach, always just a flicker. They were closer. Or I was losing my mind. The nightmares became more frequent, more intense. I started waking up with a cold sweat, my body trembling, a phantom chill clinging to me. Sometimes I'd hear the faint keening, the mournful cry seemingly carried on the night wind. Other times, the tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, would come from the walls of my room. It was always just faint enough to be dismissed as imagination, just fleeting enough to deny. But I knew it wasn't my imagination. I returned to college for the spring semester with a renewed sense of desperation. I had to find an answer. I had to find a way to break free from this curse, this mark. The academic world, with its logic and reason, felt like my only shield against the creeping madness. I found myself increasingly drawn to the more fringe aspects of geology and oceanography. I read about deep-sea exploration, about the strange creatures found in the abyssal plains, about the hydrothermal vents that supported entire ecosystems alien to the surface world. I learned about plate tectonics, about the immense forces that shaped the Earth, creating canyons and trenches far deeper than anyone had yet explored. I theorized that the fissure in the cave was connected to some vast, unknown suboceanic network, perhaps even to hydrothermal vents, providing a hidden passage to the surface world for these creatures. It was a wild, desperate theory, but it was the only one that made any sense. My research led me to a few, incredibly rare texts discussing subterranean oceans or Earth's inner seas, ancient theories long dismissed by mainstream science. These texts, often bound in leather and filled with esoteric symbols, hinted at a network of interconnected water bodies deep within the Earth's crust, vast and unexplored. It was in these texts that I found the first truly disturbing correlations. Some of these ancient texts depicted symbols, not identical to the one I'd seen on the cliff face, but similar in their twisting, organic complexity. They were described as sigils of the deep or marks of the hidden currents, and in some cases they were associated with stories of beings that resembled the ones I had seen, children of the deep, dwellers in the lightless abyss. My heart pounded as I devoured these texts, a terrible confirmation of my fears. This was not just a local legend. This was a deeper, older secret, a universal truth hidden beneath layers of dismissed mythology and forgotten knowledge. The more I learned, the more isolated I became. I couldn't share this. No one would believe me. I was becoming an expert in a field that didn't officially exist, researching a reality that was considered pure fantasy. My life was consumed by this obsession. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare that left me screaming again, Mark finally lost his patience. He sat on the edge of my bed, his face pale and serious. "Daniel, I'm worried about you, really worried. You're not sleeping, you're losing weight, and you keep muttering to yourself. You need help, professional help." I stared at him, my mind racing. He was right, of course. From his perspective, I was clearly spiraling. But how could I seek professional help for seeing ancient, telepathic, glowing entities from a hidden underwater civilization? They'd lock me up. They'd dismiss it as psychosis, and then they would truly be unchecked. "I'm fine, Mark, just going through a lot. I appreciate it, but I'm fine." My voice was hoarse, exhausted. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, you're not, and if you don't get some help, I'm going to have to tell someone, your parents, a counselor, someone." His tone was firm, full of genuine concern. I knew he meant it, and I knew I couldn't let that happen. My parents already worried. A counselor would just try to medicate me, to erase the very memories that were my burden, my curse, and my desperate hope of understanding. That night I started planning. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in college, pretending to be normal while this terrible truth consumed me. I had to go back, not to the exact cove, not yet, but to the general area. I had to find more answers, more clues, more understanding. The thought terrified me, but it was also a grim compulsion. The legend said I was bound to the obsidian shore, and perhaps if I embraced that binding, I could find a way to break it. Or at least understand it. I sold most of my belongings, packed a single backpack with essentials, and withdrew the small amount of savings I had left. I wrote a brief, vague note to Mark, apologizing for my abrupt departure, promising to explain later. I left another, equally vague note to my parents, telling them I needed a break and adventure before settling down. It was all a lie, but what else could I say? Before I left, I made one final, crucial stop at the library. I carefully took out the old book, The Deep Ones of the Obsidian Shore, and slipped it into my backpack. It was an act of defiance, a claim to the knowledge I now possessed. It was a risk, but I knew I couldn't leave it behind. It was my guide, my reference, my connection to the impossible truth. Under the cover of darkness, I walked away from the campus, away from the life I was supposed to be building, and into an uncertain future. I hitchhiked south, making my way back towards the coast, towards the wild, untamed stretches of the Pacific. The further I went, the more the familiar landscape gave way to towering redwoods and rocky cliffs, the more a strange sense of purpose settled over me. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was now tempered by a grim determination. I was no longer running from them. I was running towards the truth, towards understanding, towards whatever lay hidden beneath the waves, waiting for the marked. It took me several days to reach the general region of the cove. I avoided the small towns, sleeping rough, eating sparingly. My money was dwindling, but I didn't care. My focus was absolute. I felt like a man possessed, driven by an urgency I couldn't deny. I found a small, secluded campsite a few miles from the main road, deep in the redwoods, far enough from any human presence to feel safe, but close enough to access the coast. I was wary of driving the Tacoma there anyway. It was late afternoon when I finally set up my makeshift camp, a small tarp strung between two towering trees, a sleeping bag unrolled on the damp earth. The air was cool and thick with the scent of pine and damp soil, and the distant roar of the ocean was a constant, low thrum. I pulled out the old book, the copied notes, my sketches. I began to pore over them, cross-referencing, looking for patterns, for any hint of another cave, another location, another point of contact. I had to find a different way in. I couldn't risk going back to the same cove, not after the mark, not after the warning. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues, I felt a familiar chill seep into my bones. Not just the cold of the evening air, but that deeper internal cold. I glanced nervously around the dense forest, my hand instinctively reaching for the small, heavy rock I'd picked up as a makeshift weapon. And then I heard it. A sound so faint at first that I almost dismissed it as the wind, but it grew, carried on the twilight air. The low, mournful keening, it was unmistakable, and it wasn't coming from the direction of the ocean. It was coming from within the forest, from the depths of the redwoods, a place I had thought was safe. My blood ran cold. They were here, they had followed me, or they were already here. The legend had said, they watch, they wait. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, my eyes darting frantically through the deepening shadows. The keening grew louder, a chilling, almost melodic wail that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It was closer than I expected, too close. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing the book and my notes inside, my hands trembling. I had to move, had to get away. This wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. I fled deeper into the forest, crashing through the undergrowth, the keening sound chasing me, growing more intense with every step. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape. The ancient redwoods, once guardians, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until the keening seemed to fade into the general sounds of the forest. I collapsed against a massive redwood, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. The darkness was absolute now, the forest an oppressive black void. I stayed there for what felt like hours, huddled against the tree, listening, straining to hear any sound other than my own ragged breathing. The keening didn't return. The silence of the forest slowly reasserted itself, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. When the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, I was still shaking, but a cold resolve had settled over me. I couldn't run forever. I had to confront this. I had to find a way to understand, to fight, to survive. My old life was gone. My old self was gone. All that remained was this singular, terrifying quest. I spent the next few days in a heightened state of alert, always moving, always watching. I tried to find a less exposed camping spot, but the forest felt permeated with their presence. I avoided anything that looked like a path, sticking to the densest undergrowth, trying to leave no discernible trail. I was a phantom, haunted by ghosts. My research continued, fueled by a frantic, desperate energy. I learned about ancient geological formations, about the strange patterns of magnetic fields that could be found near certain geological anomalies. I began to piece together a new theory, a more terrifying one. What if the fissures, the caves, were not just natural occurrences, but gateways? What if the markings, the symbols, were not just art, but a form of communication? A way to interact with the world, or to manipulate it. I found obscure references to specific mineral deposits, to certain types of volcanic rock that were said to amplify or channel unknown energies. The cave I had entered, with its volcanic sand and strange, cold atmosphere, fit the description eerily well. I meticulously scanned old topographical maps, searching for other similar geological features, for other isolated coves, for any indication of a pattern. I marked potential locations, remote and difficult to access, just like the first cove. I was looking for another gateway, another place where the veil between worlds might be thin. My supplies were running low, my body aching from constant travel and lack of proper rest. My supplies were running low, my body aching from constant travel and lack of proper rest. The cold of the forest nights gnawed at me, and hunger was a dull ache in my stomach. But I pushed through it, driven by a singular, desperate purpose. Sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged in, and when I did, it was shallow and plagued by vivid nightmares. The images of the glowing entities, their silent judgment, the mournful keening, played on an endless loop in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I'd freeze, scanning the dense undergrowth, half expecting to see a shimmering form emerge from the shadows. I never did, but the feeling of an unseen presence was constant, an oppressive weight that never lifted. The keening, too, returned. Faint, distant, but undeniably there, sometimes echoing through the redwoods, sometimes seeming to whisper from the churning ocean. It felt like a lament, a warning, or perhaps a summons, drawing me inexorably closer to the truth I simultaneously craved and dreaded. My stolen book, The Deep Ones of the Obsidian Shore, became my constant companion, my only trusted guide. Its brittle pages, filled with archaic script and crude illustrations, were a lifeline to understanding. I read and reread its cryptic passages, convinced that within its forgotten lore lay the key to my survival, or at least my comprehension. I marked key phrases, drew connections, cross-referenced with my own sketches and fragmented research notes. I devoured old geological maps, searching for patterns, for anomalies that matched the descriptions in the book. I looked for isolated stretches of coastline, for specific types of volcanic rock formations, for areas with unusual magnetic field readings, anything that might indicate another gateway. The coastline of the Pacific Northwest was a labyrinth of such places, rugged and wild, often inaccessible by road, perfect for hiding secrets. Days blurred into weeks. My clothes were tattered, my skin sun-chapped and wind-burned. My face, when I caught a glimpse of it in a rare reflection, was gaunt, my eyes sunken and shadowed. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of civilization, living off the land as best I could, always moving, always searching. My search eventually led me further south, past the familiar territory of the first cove, into a wilder, more remote stretch of the coast. The maps hinted at a series of interconnected sea caves, almost entirely submerged at high tide, accessible only by a hidden, treacherous trail down a sheer cliff face. The description in one of the book's chapters, The Serpent's Maw, spoke of a similar location, rumored to be a gathering place for the children of the deep. It was a long shot, but it was the most promising lead I had. It took me another agonizing week to locate the general area, relying on outdated topographical maps and intuition. The winding dirt road eventually dissolved into an overgrown logging trail, forcing me to abandon my backpack and proceed on foot. The forest here was even denser, older, the trees looming like silent, ancient sentinels. The air was thick with mist, damp and cold, carrying the primal scent of decaying leaves and the omnipresent tang of the ocean. Finally, after hours of arduous trekking through dense undergrowth, following faint animal trails, I reached the edge of the cliff. It was even more dramatic than the first one, a sheer, unforgiving drop to a narrow, rocky beach below. The waves crashed against the base with a thunderous roar, sending spray high into the air. I peered over the edge, heart pounding. The beach below was barely visible through the mist, a strip of black volcanic sand dotted with jagged rocks. And there, at the far end of the cove, almost hidden by the swirling mist and crashing waves, was a dark, yawning maw, a cave entrance. It was larger than the first, a gaping black hole in the cliff face, perpetually churned by the surging tide. This was it, the Serpent's Maw. But getting down was the problem. The cliff face was a chaotic mess of crumbling rock and tangled roots, far more treacherous than the path at the first cove. I spent hours scouting, moving cautiously along the precipice, searching for any hint of a descent. The light was fading fast, the mist thickening, and a cold drizzle had begun to fall, making the already slick rock even more perilous. As darkness descended, cloaking the cliff in an impenetrable gloom, I heard it again. The keening, closer this time, not just from the ocean, but from the depths of the forest around me, swirling in the rising wind. It was more intense, more resonant, seeming to vibrate in my bones. It felt like a beacon, drawing me further into its ancient world. I had to be careful. They knew I was here. I retreated from the cliff edge, finding a small, hidden alcove beneath the roots of a giant redwood. I huddled there, shivering, pulling my thin jacket tighter around me. The keening continued, waxing and waning with the wind, a mournful, compelling symphony. I knew I couldn't go down tonight. It was too dangerous, too dark. I needed to wait for dawn. The night was long and terrifying. Every creak of the ancient trees, every gust of wind, every distant crash of the waves was magnified by my heightened senses. I imagined shimmering forms gliding through the darkness, their luminous eyes fixed on my hiding place. I clutched the old book, its worn cover a fragile comfort against the encroaching terror. With the first pale streaks of dawn, I forced myself to move. The mist was still thick, clinging to the trees, but the rain had stopped. I found what looked like a precarious route down, a series of narrow ledges and exposed roots, almost vertical in places. It was a climb that would test every ounce of my strength and resolve. I began the descent, my muscles screaming in protest, my fingers raw against the cold, wet rock. Every movement was slow, deliberate, each handhold and foothold tested meticulously. Loose scree clattered down the cliff face, disappearing into the churning water below. The roar of the ocean grew louder, filling my ears, making it impossible to hear anything else. It took me what felt like an eternity, but finally, scraped and bruised, I reached the narrow strip of beach. The cove was desolate, wild, and incredibly beautiful in a harsh, untamed way. Towering cliffs rose on three sides, their dark faces streaked with ancient waterlines and patches of slick green moss. The beach was a chaotic expanse of black volcanic sand and jagged, wave-smoothed boulders. The air was thick with salt and the sharp scent of seaweed. And there it was, the Serpent's Maw, a vast, dark opening in the cliff framed by water-sculpted rock. The tide was low, revealing a stretch of wet, glistening sand leading into the cave mouth. The water inside, however, still surged and swirled, suggesting a deeper, more active system within. A wave of dread washed over me, but it was quickly superseded by a fierce, almost manic determination. I had come this far. There was no turning back. I approached the cave entrance cautiously, my heart hammering. The air emanating from within was cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something indescribable, metallic and ancient. The walls of the entrance were slick with black algae, and the ground was a mixture of sand and small, smooth, dark pebbles. As I ventured further in, the light from the entrance quickly faded, plunging me into near total darkness. I fumbled in my bag for my old, battered flashlight. Its beam, weak and flickering, cut a pathetic swath through the oppressive gloom. The sound of the ocean, muted at first, grew louder, echoing off the unseen walls of the cave. I could hear the distinct sloshing and churning of water from deeper within. The passage widened considerably, leading into a vast, cavernous chamber. My flashlight beam danced across the high, arched ceiling, revealing stalactites and stalagmites glistening with moisture. The air was cold, the silence broken only by the rhythmic slosh of water and the distant roar of the sea. I began to explore, moving slowly, cautiously. The chamber was immense, far larger than the first cave, and the floor was a mix of dark sand and smooth, polished rock. There were strange, geological formations I didn't recognize, columns of rock that seemed to have been twisted and warped by immense pressure, resembling petrified, grotesque organs. As I ventured deeper, the ground beneath my feet grew noticeably colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated in the air. It was a low frequency, more felt than heard, that vibrated through the soles of my feet and up into my chest. My flashlight beam suddenly picked up something on one of the immense rock columns. My breath caught in my throat. It was a carving. Not the raw, recent gouges I'd seen on the cliff face at the first cove, but something far older, eroded by centuries of water and wind. It was the same twisting, tendril-like symbol, the mark, but here it was part of a larger, more complex tapestry of carvings, covering the entire surface of the column. My beam moved, revealing more. Intricate alien designs, swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. There were depictions of strange, elongated figures, their forms indistinct, their limbs too long, their heads too small, their faces featureless save for a hint of luminous, multifaceted eyes. They were undeniably the creatures I had seen, and they were depicted in a variety of poses, some seemingly performing rituals, others simply standing, observing. This was a sanctuary, a sacred place. I moved closer, drawn by an irresistible urge to touch the ancient carvings. My fingers traced the cold, smooth lines, feeling the deep depressions worn by time. The carvings radiated a faint internal chill, a subtle energy that prickled my skin. Then I saw it. Tucked away in a recessed alcove, almost hidden by a curtain of glistening, mineral-stained rock, was another pedestal. It was smaller than the one in the first cave, less ornate, but undeniably similar. A rough-hewn block of dark, volcanic rock, its surface also covered in ancient eroded carvings, and on its flat top a single, deep impression, a hollow, perfectly shaped to cradle something. My eyes scanned the pedestal, my flashlight beam trembling, and then I noticed the water. It wasn't just the ambient moisture of the cave. A thin, continuous stream of water was flowing from the deepest part of the cave through a narrow crack in the floor and collecting in the hollow of the pedestal, forming a small, still pool. The water was unnaturally dark, almost black, and as my flashlight hit it, I saw it. A faint greenish glow, emanating from the water itself. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the oppressive silence. This was it. This was the source of the anomalous readings, the glowing fissures, the strange energy. This was the essence of them, the mark, the binding. I stared into the glowing water, mesmerized, a terrible curiosity battling with an overwhelming dread. What was it? What was this strange, luminous liquid? Was it their lifeblood, their communication medium, their power source? The book had hinted at unearthly lights and currents of the deep. This had to be it. As I leaned closer, my shadow falling over the glowing pool, the faint hum in the air intensified, growing stronger, more resonant. The temperature in the cave seemed to drop, a bone-deep chill seeping into me. The water in the pedestal began to ripple, tiny, concentric circles expanding from its center, even though nothing had disturbed it. Then, from the deepest reaches of the cave, from beyond the pedestal, a sound began. A low, guttural murmur. It wasn't the keening I'd heard on the surface. This was different. This was the chanting. The same sound I'd heard during their ritual in the first cave, but clearer, more immediate. It was deep, rhythmic, reverberating through the rock, through my very being. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling wildly. They were here, in this cave, performing their ritual, and I had stumbled right into the heart of it. Panic seized me, sharp and cold. My first instinct was to flee, to turn and run back the way I came, back to the safety of the surface. But the sound, the chanting, held me captive. It was not just a sound. It was an intrusion into my mind, a subtle, hypnotic rhythm that resonated with the fear and obsession already festering within me. It felt like a song meant to draw me in, to bind me further. I resisted, forcing myself to take a step back, my eyes darting frantically towards the glowing pool in the pedestal. The ripples in the water grew larger, more agitated. The greenish light pulsed, growing brighter, casting eerie shadows that danced on the carved walls. And then, from the deepest part of the chamber where the chanting originated, shapes began to emerge. They were indistinct at first, merging with the shadows, but then they coalesced, taking on the familiar, terrifying forms. Tall, slender, their elongated limbs seeming to glide rather than walk. Their heads were small, almost negligible, but their eyes were unmistakable. Luminous, multifaceted, glowing with the same eerie green light that pulsed from the water. They were rising from the deep water that filled the cavern beyond, emerging into the more open spaces of the chamber. There were more of them than I had seen before, dozens, perhaps scores, their forms shifting in the dim light, their movements fluid and unnatural. They formed a semicircle around the pedestal, their backs to me, their silent, featureless faces turned towards the glowing pool. The chanting intensified, growing in volume and complexity, a symphony of guttural sounds that seemed to wrap around me, pressing in on my mind. I was trapped, hidden in the shadows, but exposed, utterly vulnerable. My flashlight beam, forgotten, was pointed at the ground, casting a small, trembling circle of light. I pressed myself against the cold rock wall, barely daring to breathe, my heart a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the chanting. This wasn't just a ritual, this felt like a communion. They were interacting with the glowing water, drawing something from it or pouring something into it. Their forms seemed to shimmer and glow with the reflected green light, their outlines blurring, becoming almost translucent. As the chanting reached a crescendo, the water in the pedestal began to bubble and churn, the green light intensifying to an almost blinding brilliance. The light pulsed, illuminating the entire chamber in an unearthly glow, casting sharp, distorted shadows of the creatures on the carved walls. And then, from the center of the glowing pool, a new form began to rise. It was slow, deliberate, emerging from the churning liquid with an agonizing slowness. It was larger than the others, more substantial, its outline denser, darker, yet still shimmering with the same iridescent green. It was crowned with strange, organic protrusions, almost like a crown of living coral, but imbued with that same alien geometry as the symbols on the carvings. The chanting softened, becoming a reverent hum, a sound of awe and submission. The creatures bowed their heads, their luminous eyes dimming slightly in deference. This was something else, something older, something that commanded their obedience. As the central figure fully emerged, its form became clearer. It was an entity of immense, ancient power. Its body was more defined, more robust than the others, its skin a dark, chitinous texture, yet still retaining that strange, fluid shimmer. Its elongated limbs ended not in hands, but in graceful, webbed appendages. Its head, though still small, possessed a definite structure, a more pronounced cranial ridge, and two immense, multifaceted eyes that glowed with an internal emerald fire. It was the Elder, the one the book had vaguely referenced as the voice from the deep. The Elder stood motionless before the pedestal, its immense eyes fixed on the now calm, intensely glowing pool of water. A profound silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves. The air vibrated with an immense, palpable energy, a silent hum that pressed down on my very soul. Then slowly, deliberately, the Elder turned its head. Its luminous emerald eyes, filled with an ancient, terrifying intelligence, swept across the chamber. They passed over the bowing creatures, then moved towards the shadows where I was hiding. My blood ran cold. It knew I was there. It had known all along. The Elder's gaze fixed on my hiding place, piercing the gloom with an unnerving intensity. I felt its mind touch mine, a cold, vast presence, not hostile, not curious, but simply aware. It was the same telepathic touch I had felt in the first cave, but amplified, more powerful, utterly overwhelming. A thought clear as a bell, yet resonating with the weight of millennia, filled my mind. You are the marked, you carry the echo, the binding strengthens. My breath hitched. The words were a confirmation of everything I had read, everything I had feared. I was not just a witness. I was a part of their ancient design. The Elder took a single, slow step towards me. The other creatures remained motionless, their bowed heads still, but I could feel their collective awareness shifting, their attention now focused on me. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like my very soul was being crushed. The Elder continued its slow, deliberate advance, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. Each step resonated through the floor, a soft, heavy thud that echoed in my chest. As it drew closer, its immense form began to fill my vision. I could see the intricate details of its chitinous skin, the subtle shifts in its iridescent glow. Its presence was overwhelming, ancient, utterly alien. It stopped just a few feet from me, its head tilted slightly, its emerald eyes peering into my very soul. The silence was absolute, save for the frantic pounding of my heart. Then another thought, clearer, more direct, filled my mind, but it was not a warning. It was a question infused with a terrible, ancient curiosity. Why do you seek us, marked one? What do you hope to gain from the knowledge you cannot comprehend? The sheer audacity of the question, combined with the raw, terrifying power of the entity, momentarily stunned me. My mind reeled, trying to formulate a response, any response, but my thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, desperation, and awe. I managed to stammer out a single raw word, a whisper barely audible in the cavernous chamber. Answers. The elder tilted its head further, its glowing eyes seeming to bore deeper into my mind, dissecting my intentions, sifting through my memories. I felt a cold invasion, a subtle probing that explored the depths of my fear, my obsession, my fragmented understanding. Answers you may seek, but knowledge has its price, the elder communicated, its voice a mental chorus that filled my skull. You are drawn to the currents as others before you. The path you walk is ancient, but often ends in dissolution. Dissolution, the word resonated with chilling finality. It wasn't just a threat. It felt like a statement of fact, a consequence. The elder's gaze shifted briefly to the old book clutched in my trembling hand. The fragments of our truth are scattered, whispered in shadows, dismissed as myth, yet you gather them. Why? My mind, still reeling from the invasion, found a spark of defiance. I need to understand, I whispered, my voice hoarse. I need to know what you are, what the mark means, how to be free of it. A faint ripple passed through the elder's immense form, a subtle shift in its iridescent glow that might have been amusement or perhaps pity. Free, the currents flow through all things, you are merely aware of their presence. The mark is not a curse, young one, it is an awakening, a recognition. An awakening, the concept was staggering. They didn't see it as a mark of ownership, but of inherent connection. My fear was being slowly eclipsed by a terrifying, profound awe. Then, from the glowing pool in the pedestal, a tendril of green light, fine as a thread, detached itself and floated towards me. It extended slowly, deliberately, until it hovered just inches from my chest, pulsing with a soft, hypnotic light. The elder's thought returned, softer now, but no less profound. You seek knowledge, we can show you glimpses, but the path is not for the faint of spirit. It is to embrace the truth, to become a conduit. To understand the currents, you must allow them to flow through you. My eyes were fixed on the glowing tendril of light. It pulsed, warm and inviting, yet terrifyingly alien. It was an offer, a choice. To step back into the world of denial and madness, or to step forward into an impossible, ancient reality at potentially unimaginable cost. My entire being screamed in protest. Every instinct for self-preservation urged me to flee, to reject this impossible offer. But a deeper, darker part of me, the part that had been consumed by obsession, by the unshakable feeling of being marked, felt a strange pull. This was what I had been searching for. This was the source. This was the truth. I looked at the elder, its vast, ancient eyes reflecting the pulsing green light. I looked at the multitude of creatures, still bowed, their luminous forms a silent, expectant chorus. I looked at the glowing tendril hovering before me like a living invitation. My hand, still clutching the old book, slowly, tremblingly, began to rise. I reached out, my fingers stretching towards the ethereal light, towards the offer of incomprehensible knowledge. Just as my fingertips brushed against the glowing tendril, a sudden, blinding flash erupted from the pedestal. The entire cavern was bathed in an intense, emerald light, so brilliant it forced me to squeeze my eyes shut. The humming intensified to a deafening roar, reverberating through my skull, through the very bones of the cave. And then, just as suddenly, it vanished. The light, the humming, the presence, everything. When I dared to open my eyes, the chamber was plunged back into relative darkness, lit only by my flickering flashlight. The pedestal was still there, the dark, almost black water still glowing faintly in its hollow. But the elder was gone. The multitude of creatures were gone. They had simply vanished, melted back into the deep water of the cavern, leaving no trace. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, broken only by the distant crash of the waves and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I stood there, trembling, my hand still outstretched, feeling the phantom warmth of the vanished light. Had it been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and terror? No, my mind was too clear, too raw with the memory. The cold air, the ancient carvings, the lingering scent of something metallic and alien, it was all too real. I lowered my hand, my fingers brushing against my chest, and then I felt it. A subtle warmth, a faint tingling sensation on my skin, exactly where the tendril of light had hovered. It wasn't a physical mark, no scar or discoloration. But it was there, an internal resonance, a deep-seated hum that now echoed the vanishing sound of the elder's presence. The mark, it had changed. It was no longer just a burden of knowledge, but a tangible connection. I felt different, not physically altered, but internally rewired. A new sensitivity, a subtle awareness of something beyond the normal. The weight of the book in my hand suddenly felt heavier, imbued with new meaning. It was not just a collection of forgotten myths. It was a key, a guide to the currents that now flowed, however faintly, through me. I looked back at the glowing water in the pedestal, then at the intricate carvings on the wall, and finally towards the dark, churning depths where the elder and its kin had vanished. The choice was still before me, the path of understanding or the path of fear, and now I had a conduit, a connection. I knew I couldn't stay here, not now. The raw intensity of the encounter had left me drained mentally and physically. I needed to process what had happened, to understand this new internal shift, but I also knew I couldn't leave, not permanently. The legend was true, I was bound. I began to retrace my steps, moving slowly towards the cave entrance. The chanting, the light, the overwhelming presence, it was all gone, but the echo lingered, a phantom sensation in my mind. My flashlight beam was still weak, still flickering, but now somehow my eyes seemed to perceive more in the gloom. Subtle shifts in shadow, faint outlines of rock formations that had been invisible moments before. As I exited the cave, squinting against the pale daylight filtering through the mist, the world seemed to have changed. The colors were sharper, the sounds more distinct. The scent of salt and pine was richer, more complex. It was as if a veil had been lifted or a new sense had been awakened within me. I looked at the turbulent ocean, then back at the dark, yawning maw of the cave. I had faced them again, and I had survived. More than that, I had been offered something, a chance to understand, to become a conduit. The climb back up the cliff was grueling, but I felt a strange, almost detached focus. My body moved with an unfamiliar efficiency, my fingers finding purchase on slick rock with an uncanny certainty. The phantom warmth on my chest, the subtle hum, was a constant reminder of the encounter, a new compass pointing me towards the unknown. When I finally reached the top, pulling myself onto the soft earth, the mist had begun to lift, revealing patches of a weak, watery sun. I stood there, catching my breath, the vastness of the redwood forest stretching before me, the endless ocean roaring behind. I was no longer just a terrified witness. I was something more, marked, awakened, and irrevocably changed. The currents flowed through me, the binding had strengthened. The fear was still there, a cold, constant companion, but now it was intertwined with a profound sense of purpose. I had been given a glimpse, I had been offered a path and a choice. I had to understand what it meant to be a conduit, what this new sensitivity truly entailed. I had to learn how to use it, how to control it, and I had to prepare myself for the inevitable, for another encounter, for the deeper truths that awaited in the hidden depths. My journey was far from over. It had only just begun. I was walking a path between worlds, a path forged by ancient entities and forgotten knowledge. And I knew with a chilling certainty that it would lead me to places beyond human comprehension, to the very heart of the Obsidian Shore's secrets. The sun, now higher, filtered through the thinning mist, casting long, ethereal shadows across the ancient redwood canopy. I stood at the cliff's edge, my chest heaving, the raw air burning my lungs. Below, the ocean roared, a constant, primal sound that had lost its former menace and now felt like a deep, resonant pulse. The serpent's maw, dark and inscrutable, was hidden once more by the swirling mists of the cove, a secret mouth guarded by the indifferent vastness of the sea. But the secrets it held were no longer entirely veiled. I had faced them, I had survived, and more than that, I had changed. The subtle warmth on my chest, the faint internal hum, it was a constant reminder, a new frequency coursing through my being. The mark was no longer just an abstract curse from an old legend. It was a tangible connection, a nascent awareness. I was a conduit. The concept was still terrifying, yet it was also exhilarating in a grim, desperate way. My entire world had been upended, rational thought shattered, but in this new, impossible reality, I felt a strange sense of direction. The path before me was dark and unknown, but it was my path. I was no longer merely a victim. I was an active participant, albeit a reluctant one, in a drama far older than humanity. I began to walk, my legs still shaky, but a new resolve stiffening my spine. My mind was a whirlwind of disjointed thoughts and profound revelations. What did it mean to be a conduit? How did one control this flow of currents? The elder's words echoed in my mind. You seek knowledge, we can show you glimpses, but the path is not for the faint of spirit. It is to embrace the truth, to become a conduit. To understand the currents, you must allow them to flow through you. It was a chilling invitation, a promise of enlightenment that threatened to shatter my remaining sanity. But I had no choice. I had already stepped onto this path and there was no turning back. The old life, the comforting illusion of normalcy, was gone. I needed to find a safe place, a sanctuary where I could explore this new sensitivity without fear of discovery or interruption. My makeshift camp was too exposed, too close to the traces of my former self. I needed to disappear completely. The next few days were a blur of intense physical exertion and mental strain. I ventured deeper into the redwood forest, always moving south, following ancient game trails and overgrown logging roads. My body ached, my clothes were in tatters, and hunger gnawed at me constantly, but the internal hum sustained me, a strange, electric current that pulsed through my veins. It was as if my senses had been amplified, allowing me to perceive the world with startling clarity, even as my physical form deteriorated. I found myself noticing things I never had before: the subtle shifts in the Earth's magnetic field, a faint resonating thrum that seemed to emanate from deep within the ground, the complex interplay of moisture and decay in the soil, the silent, intricate network of roots beneath the forest floor. It was as if the world was suddenly speaking to me in a language I was only just beginning to understand. After nearly a week of relentless trekking, I stumbled upon it, an old, abandoned ranger station nestled deep in a forgotten canyon. It was little more than a dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered, its roof partially caved in, overgrown with moss and ferns. But it was remote, hidden, and for my purposes perfect. A natural spring nearby provided fresh water, and the surrounding forest offered some meager sustenance. I set about making the cabin habitable, working with a desperate energy I didn't know I possessed. I patched the roof with tarps and fallen branches, boarded up the windows, and cleared out the accumulated debris of decades. It was a crude, primitive existence, but it was mine. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, I could finally begin to understand. My first task was to meticulously reread The Deep Ones of the Obsidian Shore. The book, once a source of terror, now felt like a precious artifact, a Rosetta Stone to an alien reality. With my heightened awareness, the cryptic passages began to yield new layers of meaning. Phrases about harmonic frequencies, geological currents, and the silent song of the abyssal deep resonated with the internal hum I now felt. I also revisited my notes and sketches. The symbol, the tendril-like mark, was everywhere. I noticed now how its organic twists mirrored the flow of water, the branching of roots, the fractal patterns of lightning. It was not just a symbol, it was a representation of flow, of connection, of energy. I started to experiment. I would sit for hours in the silent cabin, focusing on the internal hum, trying to extend my awareness outwards. At first, it was frustrating, yielding nothing but a deeper sense of my own exhaustion. But slowly, subtly, things began to shift. I discovered that if I focused on the ground beneath me, on the solid rock and soil, I could perceive the faint vibrations of the earth itself. Not just seismic activity, but a constant, low-frequency pulse, like the heartbeat of the planet. And within that pulse, I could discern subtle anomalies, disruptions in the flow, almost like distant whispers. These whispers often correlated with my memory of the keening, but now it was less a sound and more a feeling, a melancholic resonance, a call from the deep. This was the currents the elder had spoken of, not physical currents of water or air, but energetic currents flowing through the very fabric of the earth and sea. The deep ones, I realized, were not just beings of flesh and blood, but beings deeply attuned to these currents, perhaps even manifestations of them. My dreams, which had once been a torment, began to change. They were still vivid, still disturbing, but now there was a strange lucidity to them. I would often find myself back in the sea cave or observing the deep ones, but from a detached, almost ethereal perspective. Sometimes I would even glimpse the elder, its emerald eyes fixed on me, not with judgment, but with an unsettlingly calm observation. In these dreams, the guttural chanting of the deep ones no longer sounded like pure noise. It took on a rhythmic, almost mathematical quality, a sequence of complex vibrations that hinted at meaning beyond human language. I couldn't understand it, not yet, but I felt myself absorbing it, retaining its energetic patterns. My physical appearance continued to decline. My hair grew long and unkempt, my beard thick and tangled. My clothes were threadbare, my skin weathered, but my eyes were different. They held a fierce, almost unnatural intensity, reflecting the vast and terrifying knowledge I was slowly accumulating. I was no longer Daniel, the college student. I was a survivor, a seeker, a conduit. One afternoon, as I meditated by the spring, my hand resting on a moss-covered boulder, I felt a strong surge in the currents. It was a sensation of immense pressure, a sudden rush of energy flowing from deep within the earth directly through the rock and into my hand. It was overwhelming, almost painful, like an electric shock. I gasped, pulling my hand away, my heart pounding. Then the keening, not distant and faint, but close, unnervingly close. It emanated from the dense forest to the west, a low, mournful wail that vibrated in my bones. They were here, or at least their presence, their energetic signature was. This was a test, a summons, the elder had said, the binding strengthens. I was no longer just a spectator, I was being drawn in actively. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing the book and my notes inside. I also brought a heavy, sharpened branch I'd been using as a walking stick, a pathetic weapon against whatever awaited me, but a comfort nonetheless. My fear was potent, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now laced with a strange, undeniable curiosity. I had to follow the current. I had to understand. I moved cautiously through the forest, my new senses guiding me. The keening pulsed, growing stronger, leading me deeper into a ravine I hadn't explored before. The air grew colder, heavier, saturated with that metallic, alien scent I now associated with the deep ones. I reached the bottom of the ravine, a narrow, shadowed cleft in the earth. The air here was utterly still, the silence profound, broken only by the rhythmic throbbing of the currents and the low, mournful keening. And there, at the base of the ravine wall, almost completely hidden by a tangle of ancient roots and dense ferns, was a dark opening, a fissure. It was smaller than the cave entrance at the Serpent's Maw, barely large enough for me to squeeze through, but its presence resonated with the same subtle, cold energy. The rock around it was slick with moisture, and even in the dim light I could perceive a faint, almost imperceptible greenish glow emanating from within. This was another gateway, another crack in the world leading to their domain. I hesitated, my heart hammering. Was this a trap? Was I walking willingly into my own doom? The question burned in my mind, but the pull was too strong to resist. The mark pulsed on my chest, the internal hum intensifying to a roar. I was a conduit. I had to follow the current. Taking a deep breath, I squeezed through the narrow opening, my shoulders scraping against the cold, damp rock. The passage was short, a brief tunnel that quickly opened into a small, subterranean chamber. It was not a sea cave. This was a dry, or mostly dry, cavern. The air was cool and still, but the faint green glow was more pronounced here, emanating from a network of fissures in the rock walls and floor. The chamber was small, almost intimate, and centered around a single, massive boulder, its surface worn smooth by ancient forces. And standing on that boulder, motionless, observing me with those luminous, multifaceted emerald eyes, was a deep one. It was smaller than the elder, its form more slender, but undeniably one of them. Its chitinous skin shimmered faintly in the green light, its elongated limbs ending in those strange, webbed appendages. It made no sound, gave no outward sign of aggression, but its presence was overwhelming, a silent, watchful intensity that pinned me to the spot. My fear was absolute, but now a strange sense of clarity accompanied it. I could feel its presence not just visually, but energetically. I could feel the currents flowing through it, a complex symphony of vibrations that hinted at a profound connection to the earth and the hidden world beneath. Then a thought clear and sharp pierced my mind, not the vast, ancient resonance of the elder, but a more focused, direct communication. You have followed the current, you have heard the call. The voice was cold, dispassionate, yet carried a subtle undercurrent of something akin to assessment. I found my voice a hoarse whisper in the silent chamber. What do you want from me? The deep one tilted its head, its eyes fixed on mine. We observe, we learn, you are an anomaly, a human, yet receptive. The mark draws you, the currents speak to you. The mark, what is it? I pressed, desperate for answers. The binding, what does it mean? The mark is a resonance, a harmonic frequency that aligns you with our deep currents. The binding is recognition. You are a bridge, a potential conduit. A bridge, the word reverberated in my mind, a terrifying, profound concept, to bridge two realities, two species. Why me? I asked, my voice trembling. Why was I chosen? The deep one seemed to ripple, its form shimmering. Choice is a human construct. The currents flow, they select. You were in the right place at the right time. The fissure opened. Your mind was receptive. You did not break. Break. Most who glimpse our truth dissolve, their minds shatter, their spirits wither. You persisted. You sought understanding, not oblivion. This was a chilling validation. My relentless pursuit of knowledge, my desperate attempt to rationalize the impossible, had been seen not as madness, but as strength. The elder has sensed your growth, your receptivity deepens. There are currents beyond the earth and sea, currents of thought, currents of will. My mind reeled. Currents of thought. Was it talking about telepathy? As if in answer, the deep one extended one of its slender, webbed appendages. It didn't touch me, but hovered inches from my forehead. A wave of intense energy washed over me, a silent, profound intrusion into my consciousness. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, a torrent of images and sensations that flooded my mind. I saw glimpses of ancient civilizations, not human, but alien, thriving in vast crystalline cities beneath the earth, powered by the very currents I was now learning to perceive. I saw beings of immense power, shifting forms, flowing through subterranean oceans, their lives spanning millennia. I saw distant stars not as pinpricks of light, but as nodes in a cosmic network of energy, connected by unseen currents. And I saw them, the deep ones, not just as inhabitants of the Earth's abyssal plains, but as guardians, as conduits themselves, tending to the flow of these energies, maintaining a delicate balance. The vision was fleeting, a mere fraction of a second, but it left me breathless, gasping. It was too much, too vast, too alien to fully comprehend. My mind felt stretched to its breaking point, my very understanding of reality fundamentally altered. The deep one withdrew its appendage, glimpses as the elder promised. The depth of the truth is beyond your current grasp, but the potential, it is vast. What do you want me to do? I stammered, my voice weak. Observe, learn, grow. The currents are shifting. The balance is precarious. You are a bridge. You may serve a purpose in what is to come. "What is to come?" I asked, a new dread settling in my chest. But the Deep One offered no further explanation. Instead, its form shimmered, and a faint, almost imperceptible green light emanated from its very being. It turned, and with a fluidity that defied physics, it melted into the network of glowing fissures in the rock, disappearing as if it had never been there. The chamber was silent once more, save for the faint hum of the currents. I stood there, trembling, my mind reeling from the torrent of images and the chilling implications of its words. A precarious balance, shifting currents, a purpose. I didn't know what to do, I didn't know what was to come, but I knew that my journey had taken another drastic turn. I was no longer just seeking answers, I was being prepared for what I could only guess. I returned to my dilapidated cabin, my mind a storm of new information. The glimpses of ancient civilizations, the cosmic currents, the Deep Ones as guardians, it was all too much to process at once. But one thing was clear, the Deep Ones were not merely monsters. They were custodians of a secret knowledge, a reality far more complex and interconnected than I had ever imagined. I spent the next weeks in a feverish state, driven by an urgent need to understand. The visions had altered my perception profoundly. The internal hum was no longer just a faint warmth, it was a pulsating energy that seemed to guide my every thought. I found myself instinctively drawn to certain geological formations, to specific points in the landscape where the Earth's currents seemed stronger, more concentrated. I began to map these areas, using my old topographical maps as a base, overlaying them with my own intuitive sense of the currents. I marked nodes of intense energy, lines of flowing power, and anomalies where the currents seemed to twist or converge. These maps, crude as they were, started to reveal a hidden network, a subterranean grid of energy that crisscrossed the entire region, perhaps even the planet. The Deep Ones, I realized, were likely situated at key points along this grid, monitoring and perhaps even manipulating the flow of these energies. The sea caves, the fissures in the redwoods, these were access points, gateways to their hidden world, strategically placed along the most potent currents. My research became even more esoteric. I delved into theories of ley lines, earth chakras, and geomancy, subjects I would have scoffed at a year ago. But now, with my awakened senses, these ancient, discarded theories began to make a terrifying kind of sense. The Deep Ones weren't just a local legend. They were an ancient, global phenomenon tied to the very energy of the planet. My diet was minimal, my sleep erratic, but I felt a strange surge of energy. My body, though gaunt, seemed capable of enduring incredible hardships. It was as if the currents themselves were sustaining me, flowing through me, connecting me to something primal and enduring. The keening, the mournful cry, became a constant companion. Sometimes it was distant, a faint echo on the wind. Other times it was close, resonating from beneath the cabin floor, making the very earth hum. But now I no longer feared it as much. I began to perceive it as a form of communication, a frequency, a language of pure emotion. It was a lament, yes, but also a call, a warning, a song of profound connection to the world. My telepathic abilities also began to strengthen. It wasn't a clear, spoken language, not yet, but I could perceive emotions, intentions, a faint echo of consciousness in the world around me. I started to feel the presence of animals in the forest before I saw them, a ripple in their own unique energetic signature. And sometimes, faintly, on the very edge of my perception, I could hear fragments of the Deep One's thoughts, not words, but complex emotional states, anticipation, watchfulness, a profound, ancient patience. This growing sensitivity was a double-edged sword. It brought me closer to understanding, but it also threatened to overwhelm me. The sheer volume of information, the constant influx of energetic data was taxing. I often felt on the verge of mental collapse, my mind buzzing with an unbearable intensity. I had to learn to filter, to focus, to control the flow. I found solace in repetition, in the methodical process of mapping and correlating. It grounded me, gave me a concrete task amidst the swirling chaos of my internal world. My maps became increasingly complex, crisscrossed with lines and symbols, a strange fusion of geological data and esoteric lore. I was creating my own forbidden text, a personal grimoire of the unseen world. One evening, as I was hunched over my maps, the single lantern casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, I felt a new sensation. It wasn't the familiar hum of the currents, nor the mournful keening. It was a sharp, piercing pain radiating from a specific point on my map, a place miles south of my current location, deep in a rugged, almost inaccessible stretch of coastline. It was a point I had marked as a significant convergence of currents, a powerful node of energy, and now that node was screaming. The pain was immediate, visceral, as if I was feeling the suffering of the earth itself. It was a chaotic surge of raw, destructive energy, a rupture in the delicate balance. The internal hum within me pulsed violently, struggling to re-establish equilibrium. This wasn't a natural geological event. This was something else, something intentional, something violent. The Deep One's words echoed in my mind. The currents are shifting. The balance is precarious. You are a bridge. You may serve a purpose in what is to come. This was it. Whatever was to come was beginning, and it was starting with this violent disruption. My heart pounded with a mix of terror and a grim resolve. I had to go. I had to investigate. The pain in the currents was too strong, too disturbing to ignore. My identity as a conduit compelled me. I gathered my meager belongings, my backpack feeling heavy with the book and my maps. I packed what little food I had left, my sharpened stick and my flickering flashlight. The cabin, my sanctuary for weeks, now felt too small, too isolated from the unfolding catastrophe. The journey south was grueling. I walked for days, driven by the pulsating pain and the currents, my body pushed to its limits. The forest grew wilder, the terrain more treacherous. The constant influx of chaotic energy from the injured node made my head ache, my senses reel. I struggled to maintain focus, to filter the overwhelming data. As I neared the marked location, the landscape began to change drastically. The trees, once vibrant, now seemed stunted, their leaves brittle and discolored. The air grew heavy, stagnant, carrying a strange, acrid smell like ozone mixed with something metallic and decaying. The earth felt sick. I reached the edge of another sheer cliff face, but this one was different. It was scarred, cracked, as if a giant hand had ripped through the rock. Great fissures, black and jagged, stretched across its surface, some still steaming faintly. A faint, sickening green light pulsed from deep within these cracks, not the gentle, ethereal glow of the Deep One's presence, but a harsh, malevolent light, like a wound festering in the earth. Below the cove was a scene of utter desolation. The once clear waters were now murky, churning with an unnatural turbulence, filled with debris and strange, black sludge. The beach, a narrow strip of dark sand, was littered with dead fish, their bodies bloated and discolored, and strange, calcified fragments that looked like shattered bone or coral. And at the center of the cove, where the most intense pain radiated, was a sight that chilled me to the bone. The cliff face had been ripped open, exposing a gaping, raw maw far larger and more destructive than any natural sea cave. It looked less like an entrance and more like a wound. From its depths, the harsh green light pulsed violently, illuminating a scene of terrible destruction within. It was a portal, but not a natural gateway. It was a forced opening, a violent tearing of the fabric between worlds. The pain from the currents here was almost unbearable. It pulsed through my chest, through my head, a scream of agony and raw power. I could feel the earth itself groaning, struggling against this brutal intrusion. Then I heard it, not the mournful keening of the deep ones, but a different sound. A harsh, rasping clicking, like countless insects scuttling across stone, but amplified to an immense guttural symphony. And within that clicking, I could discern fragments of another form of communication, alien, aggressive, utterly devoid of the ancient patience of the deep ones. And then I saw them. They were emerging from the violently opened maw, not swimming, but scuttling onto the beach, their forms silhouetted against the malevolent green light. They were smaller than the deep ones, but far more numerous and undeniably hostile. Their bodies were hunched, carapace-like, their limbs ending in wickedly sharp claws. Their heads were large, insectoid, with multiple glowing red eyes that darted constantly, searching, assessing. These were not the deep ones, these were something else entirely. Something new, something predatory. They looked like grotesque, mutated crabs or giant insects, but with an underlying, unsettling intelligence in their movements. They clambered over the shattered rocks, their numbers growing with terrifying speed, spreading across the desolate beach like a plague. The deep one's warning echoed again. The currents are shifting. The balance is precarious. This was the shift. This was the imbalance. This was the threat. And then from the largest, most violent fissure in the cliff face, a truly monstrous form began to emerge. It dwarfed the scuttling creatures, its bulk immense, its carapace a dull obsidian black. Its numerous limbs, tipped with claws like razors, tore at the rock as it pulled itself free. Its head was a nightmare of chitin and glowing red eyes, but centered above its mouth, a single, pulsating red organ throbbed with a sickly light. This was their leader, their vanguard. The pain in the currents reached a crescendo, a raw, screaming agony that threatened to shatter my mind. The green light from the fissure pulsed wildly, and the ground beneath me vibrated with a sickening tremor. I was no longer just an observer. I was in the middle of a war. A war not just between alien species, but a war for the very soul of the earth, fought along the unseen currents of its hidden energies. My purpose, my role as a bridge, a conduit, suddenly became terrifyingly clear. I was caught between two worlds, between the ancient guardians and this new, destructive force. And the deep ones, who had been so watchful, so patient, were now silent. Their presence, the familiar hum, was overwhelmed by the chaotic, aggressive energy of these invaders. I stood frozen, hidden on the cliff above, watching the nightmare unfold below. The scuttling creatures, now hundreds strong, began to move beyond the beach, clambering up the scarred cliff face, their glowing red eyes fixed on the forest, on the world above. I had to act. I didn't know how or what I could possibly do against such a force, but the imperative was clear. The balance was broken, and I, the marked, the conduit, was somehow involved. My body trembled not just from fear, but from the raw power surging through me, the chaotic energy of the ruptured currents. The internal hum was a deafening roar, a frantic call to action. I looked at my hand at the crude staff I clutched. I looked at the old book in my backpack, at the maps filled with lines and symbols that suddenly seemed to hold the key to this impossible conflict. My human instincts screamed for flight, for survival. But the mark, the awakened conduit within me, demanded something more. It demanded participation. It demanded that I understand, that I fight. I took a shaky breath, the acrid air burning my lungs. The ground beneath me continued to tremble, and the sound of scuttling creatures grew closer, higher up the cliff face. They were coming for the world above. I had to warn someone, but who would believe me? Who could possibly comprehend the magnitude of this threat? No one. This was my burden, my fight. I felt the last vestige of my old life, my old self, finally dissolve. There was no going back to college, no rejoining normal society. That world was a flimsy illusion, shattered by the truth I now carried within me. I gripped my staff tighter, my knuckles white. My gaze swept across the invaded cove, the rising horde, then upwards towards the darkening sky. The first star appeared, a pinprick of light in the vast, indifferent cosmos. The battle had begun, and I was at its heart. The acrid stench of ozone and decay filled my nostrils, mingling with the sharp tang of salt and the primal fear that clawed at my throat. Below, the nightmare was unfolding. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the chitinous invaders scuttled from the gaping wound in the cliff, their glowing red eyes like embers in the gathering gloom. They moved with a disturbing intelligence, not aimlessly but with purpose, their multi-jointed limbs clicking against the shattered rock, scaling the cliff face with unnatural speed. My mind, already frayed by weeks of isolation and impossible truths, threatened to unravel. The internal hum, my constant companion and guide, was now a discordant roar, a cacophony of agony and aggression that echoed the earth's suffering. The pain from the ruptured currents pulsed through me, a raw, burning sensation that made my muscles twitch and my teeth ache. I gripped my sharpened stick, a pathetic defense against an alien invasion, yet it was all I had. The old book in my backpack, a repository of forgotten myths and terrible truths, felt like a lead weight, both a burden and a potential key. My eyes darted from the swarming horde to the monstrous leader, its obsidian carapace glinting malevolently in the sickly green light, its pulsating red organ a beacon of destruction. Panic, cold and absolute, screamed for flight. Every human instinct urged me to turn, to run, to bury myself deep in the forest and pray to a god I no longer believed in, that this was all a terrible dream. But the mark, the conduit, the awakened self within me held me fast. It was an anchor in the storm of my fear, a strange sense of obligation that transcended survival. I was bound. I had a purpose. I had to understand. I had to know what these creatures were, what they wanted, and what I could possibly do. My heightened senses, once a source of wonder and terror, were now overwhelmed. The air vibrated with their alien communication, a rasping clicking that grated on my nerves. I tried to filter it, to discern meaning, but it was too chaotic, too raw. Their presence was a wave of pure aggression, a predatory hunger that sought only to consume. As I watched, a patrol of the scuttling invaders reached my elevation on the cliff face, moving with surprising agility despite their cumbersome forms. Their glowing red eyes swept across the terrain, searching. I dropped to my stomach, pressing myself against the cold, jagged rock, willing myself to become invisible. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching terror. They passed within yards of my hiding spot, their clicking sounds unnervingly close. I could feel the vibrations of their movements through the rock. The stench of ozone and something vaguely metallic and fetid, like old blood mixed with burnt circuitry, permeated the air around them. They were like living weapons, bioengineered nightmares. Once they were safely past, I risked a glance over the edge. The main force was still consolidating on the beach, but more and more were climbing, fanning out into the ravaged landscape, their red eyes scanning the darkened tree line. They were preparing to move inland. This was not a reconnaissance mission. This was an invasion. I had to get closer, but not too close. I needed to observe to learn their patterns, their weaknesses, anything that could give me an edge. My internal hum, though still chaotic, began to reassert a semblance of order, guiding me not with specific instructions, but with an intuitive sense of where the currents were most vulnerable, most affected by their presence. I began to move parallel to the cliff edge, using the dense cover of the stunted, sickly trees. My every step was deliberate, silent, my senses acutely tuned to the movements of the invaders. I noticed that they seemed to prefer the areas where the green light from the fissures was strongest, as if drawing energy from the ruptures themselves. This was key. They were not just emerging from the rupture, they were exploiting it, perhaps even sustaining it. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The deep ones had spoken of the currents, of balance. These invaders were disrupting that balance, creating a massive energetic wound in the earth. Their goal wasn't just physical conquest, it was energetic disruption, a fundamental assault on the planet's unseen network. I needed to find a vantage point, a place from which I could observe the full scope of their operations without being detected. I continued to traverse the cliff, moving south, where my maps indicated a higher elevation and a more complex convergence of currents. The journey was slow, agonizing. The ground was treacherous, littered with debris from the scarred cliff face. The air grew colder as night fully descended, the moon obscured by thick, churning clouds. The only light came from the malevolent green glow below and the darting red eyes of the invaders. After what felt like hours, I found it, a small, almost perfectly concealed outcrop nestled amongst a cluster of twisted, resilient pines. From here, I had a panoramic view of the invaded cove. The sight was horrific. The entire cove was now swarming with the creatures. They were systematically dismantling the natural landscape, tearing at the rock, widening the fissures with tools or abilities I couldn't discern from this distance. The monstrous leader, now fully emerged, stood before the gaping maw, its pulsating red organ glowing with sickening intensity, radiating waves of destructive energy that seemed to warp the very air around it. It wasn't just a leader, it was a catalyst. It was somehow enhancing the rupture, feeding it, making it grow. My connection to the currents screamed in agony, echoing the earth's suffering. The pain was so intense it made me double over, gasping for breath, clutching my head. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing my brain, a relentless assault on my every nerve ending. And then through the chaotic roar of pain, a faint, familiar hum. It was the deep ones. Their presence, once overwhelmed, was now struggling to reassert itself, a desperate countercurrent against the destructive flow. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a thread of ancient patience and profound concern weaving through the invaders' aggressive cacophony. They were still watching, they were still here, but they were not acting directly. Why were they unable to, or were they waiting for something, for me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The deep one had called me a bridge, a conduit. Was I meant to be their agent, their weapon against this new threat? The idea was preposterous, terrifying. I was just a human, a student, ill-equipped for interdimensional warfare. But the alternative, to do nothing, felt worse. The earth was crying out. The balance was broken. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to focus on the faint hum of the deep ones. I needed to understand their message, their intentions. I let go of my fear, let go of my human limitations, and allowed the currents to flow through me, to filter the noise, to seek the signal. Images flooded my mind, not as clear as the previous glimpses, but fragmented, urgent. I saw shimmering forms like the deep ones struggling against powerful, destructive currents. I saw ancient glyphs, similar to those in the caves, glowing faintly, but being consumed by a corrosive green energy. I saw a delicate web of light spanning the globe, being torn apart at key nodes. And then a thought clearer than the images, infused with an ancient sorrow. The web unravels, the nodes are compromised, we are restrained. Our direct intervention risks a greater collapse. Restrained, they were unable to act directly. Their presence, their very connection to the currents, was somehow linked to the balance itself. A direct conflict might shatter the entire system, leading to an even greater catastrophe. You are outside the webs, you are different, a new thread, a new pathway. The words resonated with profound weight. I was their last hope, a wild card unbound by their ancient pacts and limitations. The fissure must be sealed, the catalyst removed, the energies must be redirected, the balance restored. Sealed, redirected, restored, the task was immense, impossible. How could a single human, armed with a stick and a book, accomplish such a feat? The heart of the rupture, it feeds, it grows, it is vulnerable. Find the weakness, the core. The core, I looked down at the monstrous leader, its pulsating red organ glowing fiercely. Was that the core, the catalyst? The ancient knowledge you're binding, the currents flow through you, you are the key. The communication faded, leaving me trembling, my mind reeling. The deep ones had given me a mission, a suicidal one. I opened my eyes, my gaze fixed on the leader creature. It was the source of the overwhelming destructive energy, the heart of the invasion. If I could stop it, perhaps the fissure could be sealed, the currents redirected. But how? It was surrounded by hundreds of its kin, all armed with razor claws and an aggressive, predatory nature. And even if I got past them, what could I do to a creature of that size and power? My eyes fell on the old book, still clutched in my hand. It was my only weapon of true knowledge. I opened it, flipping through the worn pages, my heightened senses now able to extract more meaning from its cryptic verses. I scanned for anything about weaknesses, about stopping the creatures, about sealing gateways. I found it tucked away in a passage I had previously dismissed as pure myth. A section describing the tearing of the veil, a catastrophic event from forgotten antiquity. It spoke of entities of consuming hunger that feasted upon the energetic fabric and a method of banishment through harmonic disruption. The true binding is not of flesh, but of frequency. To sever the intrusion, one must resonate with the deepest song of the earth and sing a counterchord, a resonance that shatters the unholy frequency. Harmonic disruption, counterchord, resonate, it was all about energy, about frequencies. My mind flashed back to the deep ones chanting, the complex vibrations I had felt in my dreams. It was a language of pure energy, a song of the earth. I was a conduit. I could feel the currents. Could I manipulate them? Could I sing that counterchord? The idea was insane, impossible, but no more insane than everything else I had experienced. I looked at my crude maps, at the lines and symbols I had drawn, the convergence points, the nodes of power. The fissure was a major node, now corrupted. The elder had shown me glimpses of cosmic currents, of global networks. This was not just a local problem. This was an attack on the planet's energetic system. My plan began to form, raw and desperate. I couldn't fight them physically. I had to use what I was, what I had become. I had to use the currents. First, I needed a deeper understanding of their frequency, the destructive chord they were singing. I needed to attune myself to the chaos, to feel its rhythm, its intent. It was dangerous, akin to embracing madness, but it was the only way. I closed my eyes again, forcing myself to push through the pain, to focus on the chaotic energy radiating from the leader creature. I allowed the destructive currents to flow through me, not fighting them, but observing them, analyzing their patterns. My mind became a sponge, soaking up the aggression, the hunger, the raw, destructive intent. It was overwhelming. My body convulsed, a scream caught in my throat. I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside, my own energy signature warring with theirs. But I persisted, driven by the Deep One's desperate message, by the agony of the earth. Slowly, agonizingly, patterns began to emerge from the chaos, a rhythm of destruction, a specific dissonant frequency that resonated with the ruptures that amplified the pain. It was a frequency of uncreation, of unraveling. And then, an even more terrifying realization: they weren't just creating ruptures, they were feeding on the chaotic energy these ruptures produced. They were parasitic, draining the planet's life force, using the green light as a sustenance. The leader, the catalyst, was a massive energy siphon. This new knowledge brought a fresh wave of horror, but also a sliver of hope. If they fed on the chaos, perhaps a sudden, overwhelming infusion of balanced energy, a pure, resonant counterchord, could disrupt their feeding, perhaps even overload them. My mind raced. I needed to get closer to the leader, to the heart of the rupture. I needed to unleash a focused burst of harmonic energy, a frequency strong enough to counter and shatter their destructive chord. But how to create such a thing? I had no power source, no amplifier. I was just a human conduit. Then I remembered the elder's words: to understand the currents, you must allow them to flow through you. And the Deep One's vision: the true binding is not of flesh, but of frequency. I was the amplifier. My own body, my awakened mind, was the conduit. The mark was the resonance chamber. The thought was both empowering and terrifying. It meant putting my very being, my sanity, perhaps my life, on the line, but there was no other choice. My gaze fell on the specific lines and nodes on my map, the places where the Earth's currents converged most powerfully. The fissure, the invaded cove, was such a point. But there was another nearby, slightly higher up, a smaller, dormant node I had marked as exceptionally pure, a place where the Earth's natural hum was clearest, most resonant, a wellspring of primal energy. That was it. I needed to reach that pure node. I needed to tap into its primal energy, to channel it through my body and unleash it as a focused counterchord against the invader's destructive frequency. The plan was suicidal, but it was a plan. I began to move, crawling away from my vantage point, keeping low, blending into the shadows. The scuttling creatures were everywhere now, their red eyes scanning, their clicking communications filling the air. I had to be silent, swift, and utterly precise. The journey to the pure node was fraught with peril. I moved through dense thickets over jagged rock, constantly aware of the invader's presence. My enhanced senses, usually a blessing, were now a torment, every rustle, every distant click magnified into a potential threat. I could feel their collective consciousness, a predatory hum that vibrated with malicious intent. I narrowly avoided several patrols, pressing myself against rock faces, hiding beneath fallen logs, my heart pounding so hard I thought they would hear it. The acrid smell of ozone and decay grew stronger, and the chaotic pain in the currents intensified with every step. Finally, after an eternity, I reached the pure node. It was a small, sheltered alcove, hidden behind a waterfall of moss and ferns where a clear spring bubbled from the earth. The air here was strangely serene, almost untouched by the surrounding devastation. The familiar, balanced hum of the currents was strong here, clear and pure, a soothing balm against the chaotic roar in my mind. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and terror. I drank deeply from the spring, the cool, pure water a blessing against my parched throat. The serenity of the place was a momentary reprieve, a brief moment of calm before the storm. I pulled out the old book, my fingers tracing the ancient symbols on its cover. The words of the Elder of the Deep One echoed in my mind. You are the marked, you carry the echo, the binding strengthens. You are a bridge, a potential conduit. The true binding is not of flesh, but of frequency. I had to fully embrace it now, to become the conduit, to become the bridge. I placed my hands on the earth, closing my eyes and focused. I pushed away the fear, the exhaustion, the pain. I opened myself completely to the flow of the currents, allowing the pure, primal energy of the node to surge through me. It was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. A torrent of raw, unadulterated life force poured into my body, vibrating through every cell, every nerve. My internal hum intensified, not with chaos, but with a pure, resonant power. I felt a profound connection to the earth, to the ancient wisdom embedded in its core, to the vast, cosmic currents the deep ones had glimpsed. I was no longer just Daniel. I was a vessel, a channel. I focused on the destructive frequency of the invaders, the dissonant chord of chaos and consumption. I held it in my mind, distinct from the pure energy now coursing through me, and then, slowly, deliberately, I began to form the counterchord. It was not a sound I made with my voice, but a resonance within my very being. A complex vibration, woven from the pure energy of the node, infused with the balanced hum of the deep ones and directed by my intent. I focused every fiber of my being, every thought, every emotion into creating this counterfrequency. It was agonizing. It felt like my brain was being twisted and pulled, my skull expanding with the immense pressure. Blood trickled from my nose and my vision blurred at the edges, but I pushed through, driven by the knowledge of what was at stake. My hands began to glow faintly, a soft, ethereal blue, the color of raw energy. The mark on my chest pulsed with an intense, internal light. The air around me crackled, charged with an invisible power. The counterchord began to build, a silent, resonant hum that grew in intensity, vibrating through the earth, through the air, through the very fabric of reality. It was a song of pure, primal balance, a direct challenge to the invader's destructive frequency. I opened my eyes, my gaze fixed on the ravaged cove below, on the pulsating red organ of the leader creature. It was time. With a surge of desperate will, I unleashed the counterchord. A wave of pure blue energy erupted from my body, not a physical blast, but an invisible, vibrating pulse that shot out from the node, across the ravaged landscape, and slammed into the invaded cove. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The harsh green light from the fissures flickered violently, then dimmed, as if struggling against an opposing force. The chaotic pain in the currents, which had been a constant torment, suddenly spasmed, then began to recede, replaced by a profound, agonizing confusion. Below, the scuttling invaders froze. Their incessant clicking ceased. Their glowing red eyes darted wildly, not with aggression, but with a primal, disoriented terror. They began to twitch, their multi-jointed limbs spasming uncontrollably. Some collapsed onto the ground, their forms dissolving into shimmering dust. The monstrous leader, its pulsating red organ glowing with a desperate, frantic intensity, thrashed violently. Its obsidian carapace cracked, fissures appearing across its surface, glowing with the same pure blue light that now radiated from me. It let out a sound, not a clicking, but a piercing, metallic shriek of pure agony that resonated through the cliff face, making the very stones tremble. The counterchord was working. It was disrupting their energetic coherence, severing their connection to the chaotic currents and breaking their parasitic hold. But it was taking a terrible toll on me. The raw power flowing through me was immense, threatening to rip my body apart. My muscles screamed, my bones ached, and my mind felt stretched beyond its breaking point. I was bleeding from my nose and ears, and my vision was fading in and out. I couldn't hold it for much longer. I needed to focus it, to amplify it, to direct it at the source. With a final, desperate surge of will, I channeled all the remaining energy, all the pain, all the hope, into a single, focused beam aimed at the leader's pulsating red organ. The blue energy intensified, becoming a blinding, ethereal beam that shot across the cove, slamming directly into the leader. The creature's shriek intensified, a sound of unimaginable pain and fury. Its obsidian carapace exploded inwards, shards of chitin raining down on the beach. The pulsating red organ flared with a final, blinding burst of malevolent energy, then imploded, collapsing into a vortex of green and blue light that rapidly spiraled inwards, consumed by the pure counter-harmonic energy. As the leader disintegrated, the chaotic green light from the fissures winked out completely. The ground stopped trembling. The terrible, acrid smell began to dissipate. The remaining invaders, stripped of their leader, their energy source, and their cohesive frequency, simply collapsed. Their forms shimmered, broke apart, and dissolved into fine, black dust that was swiftly carried away by the ocean wind. Within minutes, the entire horde was gone, vanished as if they had never been. The cove was silent once more, save for the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves. The air felt lighter, purer. The pain in the currents, the agonizing scream of the earth began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion and relief. I collapsed, my body spasming, the blue light fading from my hands. The pure energy of the node receded, leaving me drained, utterly spent. My consciousness flickered, darkness encroaching at the edges of my vision. But before I fully succumbed, I felt it. The familiar, balanced hum of the deep ones. It was stronger now, clearer, infused with a subtle resonance of gratitude, recognition. And then a clear, profound thought echoing in my mind as I drifted into unconsciousness. The bridge holds the balance restored for now. For now, the words lingered, a chilling reminder that this was only a reprieve. I awoke to the muted light of dawn filtering through the dense canopy. My body ached in every single cell as if I had been physically torn apart and reassembled. My head throbbed and a metallic taste lingered in my mouth. I was weak, disoriented, but alive. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. My clothes were tattered, my skin bruised and scraped, but the mark on my chest pulsed with a steady, reassuring warmth, a deep internal hum that was now harmoniously intertwined with the earth's currents. It was no longer a burden, but a part of me, a deep-seated connection to the world around me. I stumbled to the edge of the alcove, peering out at the cove below. It was changed, but not entirely destroyed. The sheer cliff face was still scarred, but the gaping, raw maw was gone. In its place, the rock face had slowly begun to knit itself together, covered in a strange, iridescent sheen like a fresh wound healing. The murky water was clearing, and the dead fish were gone, presumably swept away by the tide. The beach was still littered with shattered fragments, but the sense of malevolence, of parasitic hunger, had vanished. The earth was healing. The balance was being restored. I had done it. I, Daniel, a simple human, had, with the help of ancient entities and forgotten knowledge, saved a small corner of the world from an interdimensional invasion. The sheer magnitude of it was overwhelming, almost incomprehensible. But the Deep One's words echoed, for now. This was a battle won, not the war. I looked at my hands. They no longer glowed blue, but they felt different, stronger, more attuned. My senses were still heightened, but the chaotic roar was gone, replaced by a profound, clear awareness of the world's energetic flow. I could feel the currents, not just as abstract forces, but as a living, breathing network of energy that connected everything. I was no longer just a conduit. I was an active participant, a guardian perhaps. My gaze drifted further south to the endless expanse of the ocean. The Deep Ones had said there are currents beyond the earth and sea, currents of thought, currents of will, and the web unravels, the nodes are compromised. This was one node healed, but what about the others? How many more ruptures had these invaders created? How many other worlds were they attacking? A new purpose, clearer and more urgent than before, solidified in my mind. I couldn't go back to my old life, that was truly gone. I was bound to this new reality, to this unending war between dimensions. I had to learn more. I had to understand how to fully use my abilities. I had to find the Deep Ones again, to communicate with them, to learn their ancient wisdom. And I had to find the other compromised nodes, to fight back against the consuming hunger of these invaders wherever they appeared. My journey was far from over. It had only truly begun. I was walking a path forged by ancient entities and forgotten knowledge, a path that stretched across the globe and perhaps even beyond. I was a bridge between worlds, and now I understood my role. I picked up my backpack, the old book now feeling like an extension of myself. I gripped my sharpened stick, no longer a pathetic weapon, but a symbol of my resolve. My body was still weak, but my spirit was resolute. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light through the forest. The air was fresh, alive with the scent of pine and damp earth. The world, bruised but recovering, stretched out before me. I began to walk, heading towards the rising sun, towards the unknown. My destination was uncertain, but my purpose was clear. I was a guardian of the currents, a protector of the balance, and I would fight for as long as I could against the consuming shadows that sought to unravel the very fabric of existence. My path was dangerous, solitary, and riddled with incomprehensible terrors, but I was no longer afraid to walk it. I was ready. My steps were slow, deliberate, each movement a testament to the pain and triumph that had forged me anew. The rising sun, now fully clearing the horizon, bathed the landscape in a fragile gold, a stark contrast to the malevolent green that had pulsed from the earth mere hours before. The world was quiet, but it was not empty. I could feel the currents, a vast and intricate symphony of energy humming beneath my feet, through the trees, and across the expanse of the ocean. They were still bruised, still recovering from the rupture, but they were flowing steadily towards a fragile equilibrium. I reached the forest's edge, the path leading back towards the north, towards my makeshift cabin. It was a familiar route, yet everything felt profoundly different. The trees, though still bearing the scars of the invaders' chaotic energy, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The air, no longer heavy with decay, carried the crisp scent of pine and damp earth, a promise of renewal. As I walked, I sifted through the fragmented memories of the night, the overwhelming sensations, the raw power that had coursed through me. It was still almost too much to comprehend. I had channeled the Earth's primal energy, sung a counterchord, and banished an interdimensional invasion. The absurdity of it made a weak, breathless laugh escape my lips, a sound that was both joyful and tinged with the lingering edge of madness. My mind, however, was clearer than it had ever been. The internal hum, the mark on my chest, pulsed with a steady, resolute rhythm, a constant reminder of my new identity. I was no longer just Daniel, the terrified student. I was a conduit, a bridge, a guardian. The fear was still there, a cold knot deep in my gut, but it was tempered now with a fierce, unyielding resolve. I had faced the impossible and survived. I had made a choice. I reached the cabin by mid-morning, its dilapidated form a welcome sight. It was my sanctuary, the place where I had begun to understand, to awaken. I collapsed inside, the familiar scent of old wood and moss-covered earth a comfort. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to rest, my body demanding respite. I slept deeply, not plagued by nightmares, but by dreams of flowing currents, of ancient symbols, of the watchful, emerald eyes of the deep ones. When I awoke, the sun was setting, painting the cabin walls in hues of orange and purple. I felt stronger, the aching in my bones lessened, replaced by a subtle tremor of renewed energy. I was hungry, my stomach rumbling fiercely, but the thought of food was secondary to the urgency that now filled me. I retrieved my maps, spreading them across the rough-hewn table. The marked nodes, the lines of flowing power, the anomalies, they now held a terrifying new significance. The Deep Ones had spoken of the web unraveling, of nodes compromised. This one rupture was sealed, but how many others were there? How vast was this war, and how many other bridges were needed? My gaze drifted to the old book, The Deep Ones of the Obsidian Shore. It was no longer a cryptic text, but a living document, a key to a hidden reality. I opened it, my fingers tracing the symbols that now resonated with an innate understanding. The passages about harmonic frequencies and geological currents were no longer abstract concepts. They were the very language of the world I now inhabited. I knew I needed to delve deeper, to unlock every secret, to prepare myself for what lay ahead. The Deep Ones had retreated into their profound silence, their presence a faint hum on the edge of my perception. They were observers, custodians, but they had also been my guides, my teachers. I knew I would need to seek them out again, to learn more, to understand the full scope of my abilities and the true nature of this war for the planet's unseen energies. The memory of the specific deep one, its cold, dispassionate voice, its unsettling assessment, resonated in my mind. The bridge holds, the balance restored for now. That for now echoed with chilling clarity. This was not an ending, it was a beginning. I looked down at my hands, still calloused and scarred, but now subtly different. I flexed my fingers, feeling the faint stirrings of the currents within me, a gentle hum that promised untold potential. I had faced an alien horde, channeled the Earth's power, and survived. I had been tested, transformed, and had embraced my impossible purpose. My path stretched out before me, long and solitary, fraught with unimaginable dangers. I would be a wanderer, a seeker, constantly vigilant, forever attuned to the shifting currents of the world. I would search for other ruptures, other invasions, other threats to the delicate balance. I would learn to master the energies that flowed through me, to become a true guardian of this planet, visible or unseen. I gathered my meager belongings, the backpack, the book, my now trusted staff. The cabin, my refuge, now felt like a launching point. I had found what I sought, and in doing so, had lost everything familiar. But I had gained something immeasurably more profound: purpose. As I stepped out of the cabin, the full moon cast a silver glow over the forest. The air was cool and still. The faint, balanced hum of the deep ones was a constant, comforting presence. There was no going back, only forward into a world far stranger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I turned my back on the cabin, on the last vestiges of my old life, and headed into the moonlit woods. My journey was only just beginning, and I was ready for whatever ancient horrors, cosmic battles, or hidden wonders awaited me. I was Daniel, the conduit, and the currents were my guide.